The maintenance crew gave up. Richard Whitmore shouted, his voice trembling through the violently shaking cabin. They gave up. Do you hear me? They don't know how to fix it anymore. For one terrifying moment, no one answered. The private jet dipped nose first, shuddering as if it were about to break apart. Then it suddenly tilted hard to one side, as though some invisible hand had grabbed the wing and was dragging it down from the sky. A stack of contracts slid off the table and burst across the carpet at Richard's feet. White pages flew wildly through the cabin, striking leather seats, overturned glasses, and pale faces frozen with fear. Annie Carter unfastened her seatbelt. She did not wait for permission. One hand gripped the armrest, while the other caught the top of the nearest seat. As the cabin tilted, her shoulder slammed into the edge of a leather headrest. Pain shot through her, but Annie clenched her jaw, steadied herself, and began moving forward. One row at a time, one step at a time. She held on to the backs of the seats so she would not be thrown into the aisle. "Sit down," someone shouted. Annie kept moving. The plane shook violently again. A man in a gray suit clutched the edge of the table in front of him with both hands. "Is it going down?" he shouted, staring toward the cockpit door. Across from him, a woman in a red scarf pressed her phone to her ear, even though the call had been disconnected long ago. No signal, no signal. Why is there no signal? Another passenger, a broad-shouldered investor who had spent the first half of the flight bragging about timing the market, fumbled with his seatbelt and muttered curses under his breath. "Whitmore, tell them to turn this plane around." Richard did not answer. He stood between two rows of seats, one hand braced against the cabin wall, the other gripping the satellite phone connected to his ground maintenance team. His face was so pale that all his power, all his money, and all his habit of giving orders could no longer hide his fear. Near the forward technical compartment, a narrow floor panel had been opened. Two maintenance specialists who had flown with Richard for emergency support were crouched beside it, with tablets, headsets, and a portable diagnostic unit secured to the cabin wall in front of them. Victor Hayes, the maintenance chief, stood over them. One hand gripped the edge of a cabinet while the other kept gesturing as he barked orders through his headset. The diagnostic screen flashed red. Core system control. Feedback loop unstable. Override failed. Annie saw the message before Victor realized she had come close. She stopped near the forward compartment, gripping the last row of seats. Her hair had fallen around her face. Her breathing was fast, but not frantic. Beneath her feet, the plane vibrated in an uneven rhythm that made her stomach tighten. Victor shouted at one of the technicians, "Run the secondary reset again." "We already did," the younger technician said, panic in his voice. "It returns to the fault state before the feedback can stabilize." "Then force the override." Annie stepped closer. "Don't force the override." Victor spun around as if he had heard a sound he did not have time to care about. His eyes stopped on her badge, then on her face, then on the way she had to lean against the seat to stay upright. "What are you doing here?" "I can check it," Annie said. "Step aside and let me see the control panel." Victor stared at her. "What did you just say?" "The loop is not resolving because something keeps feeding a false signal into the system. If you force the override again, you'll make it fight itself harder." One of the two technicians looked up from his tablet. For a brief second, he looked more surprised than angry, but Victor did not give him a chance to speak. He stepped in front of Annie and reached out, pushing her back from the open floor panel. "Back away now." Annie held on tightly to the seat beside her and kept her footing. "I'm trying to help. You're trying to get yourself killed and distract the only people on this aircraft who know what they're doing." The plane suddenly dropped again. The woman in the red scarf screamed. The man in the gray suit folded forward. His eyes squeezed shut. The investor shouted, "God help us. Somebody do something." Annie looked past Victor toward the open control panel. Beneath the floor, bundles of cables fed into a compact black control box. The vibration traveled through the cabin in short pulses. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 beats again. Annie looked straight into Victor's eyes. "The control system isn't dead. It's stuck." Victor gave a short, angry laugh. "A stuck system? That is your diagnosis?" "This is a core system loop," Annie said. "The primary controller, backup feedback, and weather sensor data are fighting each other. Something is lying to the system, and every time you restart it, you make it believe the false signal even more." Richard turned sharply toward them. What did she just say? Victor pointed at Annie without taking his eyes off her. She is an office intern, Mr. Whitmore. She is not licensed, and she is not trained on this aircraft model. Annie said, You don't know how I was trained. Victor's face went rigid. Then he stepped closer, blocking her completely from the open technical panel. Are you insane? He snapped. This is not a toy box for a child to play with. One wrong touch from you right now could collapse the pressure system and kill everyone on this aircraft. Go back to your seat and fasten your seatbelt before you make this worse. The words struck Annie like a slap, but she did not step back. One hand held the seat back. The other pressed against the cabin wall to keep her balance. The plane lurched again, and this time Victor himself had to grab the counter to keep from falling. The woman in the red scarf turned to Richard, her voice shaking. Mr. Whitmore, don't let her touch anything, please. We don't know what she's doing. The man in the gray suit nodded repeatedly, sweat shining across his forehead. She isn't crew. I'm sorry. But our lives should not be in her hands. The investor leaned forward, his face twisted with fear. Richard, listen to your maintenance chief. Don't gamble with all of us because some girl thinks she heard something. Annie looked at each of them. They were all afraid, and fear sometimes made people cruel without letting them admit it. Richard's breathing grew heavy. He looked from Victor to the passengers, then finally to Annie. Sit down, Richard shouted. You're in the way. Let the professionals handle this. Annie's fingers tightened around the seat back. Sir, they already tried the professional way. Victor's eyes flashed. Careful with your mouth. I am listening to the system, Annie said. That is what everyone else stopped doing. Richard stepped toward her, his anger rising from fear that had nowhere else to go. I told you to sit down. I do not need you blocking the aisle, distracting my team, or turning this cabin into a circus. Before Annie could answer, the plane dipped again. The floor seemed to vanish beneath everyone's feet. The woman in the red scarf screamed. The man in the gray suit collapsed back into his seat. One of the maintenance tools slid across the floor and slammed into the leg of the open panel. The captain's voice came over the intercom, tense but controlled. Mr. Whitmore, we are still losing altitude. Control authority is degrading. I need a decision. Victor hurriedly picked up the tablet from the floor and stared at the flashing diagnostic display. For the first time, his expression changed. Victor, Richard said, his voice dropping. Can you fix it? Victor did not answer right away. The cabin seemed to shrink around them. Alarms rang continuously. Rain lashed against the windows. Somewhere beneath the dark clouds, the Atlantic Ocean waited, cold and merciless. The man in the gray suit whispered, Oh my God. The woman in the red scarf covered her mouth. The investor stopped talking too. Annie looked at Richard. She did not beg. She did not try to look heroic. She only said, Give me 3 minutes. If I'm wrong, you lose 3 minutes. If he's wrong, you lose the plane. Victor snapped toward her. You arrogant little. Enough, Richard said. Victor froze. Richard looked at Annie again, and for the first time since the flight had begun, he truly saw her. Not the badge around her neck, not the job title he thought she had, not the seat in the back where she had sat quietly for half the flight, but the person standing in front of him while his jet, worth tens of millions of dollars, was falling toward the sea. The plane dropped again. Red warning lights swept across Richard's face. Finally, he turned to Victor. Move. Victor stiffened. Sir, you can't be serious. Richard's voice still shook, but the order was clear. The maintenance crew gave up. She hasn't. Victor remained where he was. Richard shouted, I said move. Victor stepped aside, his jaw clenched, his eyes still burning with contempt. Annie knelt beside the open technical panel and looked into the narrow compartment below. Heat rose from the darkness beneath the floor. Cable bundles trembled in their brackets. The red screen was still flashing, but the rhythm of the cabin was telling her something else. Annie took one breath, then another. Then she climbed down into the shaking darkness beneath the aircraft floor. The avionics bay beneath the aircraft floor was narrower than Annie had imagined. Viewed from the passenger seats, it looked like nothing more than a small maintenance hatch. But as she knelt close to the edge of the floorboards, with the fuselage vibrating violently beneath her knees and a blast of hot air hitting her square in the face, Annie finally understood why ordinary people would never want to crawl down there in the middle of a plunging flight. She lowered one leg first, feeling around for the metal bracket her father had marked in 3 different diagrams in his old notebook. The toe of her shoe slipped once. Above her, Victor let out a soft groan that sounded almost gleeful, as if he had been waiting for her to fail since before she even started. "Careful," a young technician blurted out. Victor shot him a look immediately. "Don't, Coach Hare." Annie ignored them both. Her fingers gripped a ridged support bar tightly. She slowly lowered herself until her shoulders cleared the cabin floor. The heat enveloped her arms. A pungent odor wafted up, stinging her nostrils. The smell of scorched insulation, old dust, ozone, and the sharp tang of electronics being pushed past their limits. She knew that smell. Her father, Samuel Carter, used to call it the smell of a machine sweating out its own lies. The plane suddenly pitched downward. Annie's hip slammed hard against the wall of the compartment. A sharp pain shot through her, nearly making her cry out. But she gritted her teeth and held on tight. Above, someone gasped in panic. Richard cursed softly under his breath. Victor leaned down to look through the hatch. If this intense journey touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Comment below to let us know where in the world you are watching this video from. "You don't even know what you're looking at," he said. Using 2 fingers, Annie pulled a small flashlight from her coat pocket and clicked it on. The beam swept over bundles of wiring, retaining clips, small junction boxes, and a matte black control housing bolted to the center rail. Some cables were clearly labeled in printed manufacturer lettering. Others vanished behind shields and paneling things that couldn't be removed without specialized tools and time they didn't have. "I know enough not to keep repeating a self-feeding error loop," she said. Victor scoffed. "You talk as if those words actually mean something." "They do," Annie replied. "You just don't like the person saying them." Victor was about to fire back, but the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tight as a snapping wire. "Passing 14,000 feet. Descent rate continues to increase. We're getting erratic feedback from the left stabilizer and a sluggish response from the right." Annie closed her eyes for a second, not to pray, but to listen. The aircraft wasn't making just a single sound. It was layers of noise piled on top of each other. The groaning of the fuselage, the shriek of the wind outside the windows, the jerky movements of the control system, and an anomalous vibration running through the wire bundles beneath her palms. 3 pulses. A pause. 3 more pulses. She opened her eyes. "I need the coupler for the auxiliary weather data feed." Victor let out a harsh laugh. "You don't need anything. You need to get the hell out of there." The young technician hesitated for a fraction of a second, then glanced down at his tablet. "The weather signal line runs through the lower left bundle." Victor snapped. "Kyle." Kyle kept his head down. "I'm just telling her where it is." Annie leaned to the left, propping one knee against a bracket. The plane shuddered violently again. Her shoulder scraped against the underside of the floorboards, tearing a seam in her coat. She located the lower left bundle and traced it with her flashlight. Blue marking, white marking, yellow marking, then a smaller gray cable, tucked behind the rest of the bundle, almost completely hidden from view. Annie caught her breath. In her father's notebook, Samuel had circled a similar wire and written beside it, "Not the cause, the liar." Annie looked up. "Richard, I need my bag." For a second, no one moved. "My bag," she repeated. "The canvas one. In the back seat. There's a brown notebook inside." Richard looked toward the rear cabin, then at the passengers still cowering in their seats, tightly buckled. The investor immediately protested. "You can't listen to her right now." Richard's gaze snapped to him. "Unless you have a better idea, shut up." It wasn't out of nobility, just fear speaking in a different tone, but it gave Annie what she needed. The woman in the red scarf, trembling, unbuckled her seatbelt and reached across the aisle to grab Annie's bag. "Here," she said, her voice shaking. "I've got it." The bag was passed from hand to hand. A lawyer slid it along the floor as the plane tilted again. Richard stopped it with the toe of his shoe, pulled out the brown notebook, and crouched near the hatch. "This one?" he asked. Annie looked up. The page with the red tab. Richard opened the notebook. His hands were shaking so badly that the pages fluttered. The sight caught Annie off guard more than she expected. The man who always issued orders in a commanding voice was now trembling before the old handwriting of a deceased mechanic. "Read the line below the diagram," she said. Richard swallowed hard. When the loop is locked, do not fight the system. Eliminate the false signal. Victor leaned in close. That is not an approved procedure. Annie looked back at the gray cable. Neither is crashing into the Atlantic. The captain's voice came through again. 12,000 feet. A soft collective groan rippled through the cabin. Someone began to murmur the Lord's Prayer. Eleanor Grant's voice started a few words before trailing off. She turned toward the hatch. "Annie," she said, "what do you need us to do?" That question anchored Annie, not because Eleanor could fix the system, but because she asked as if Annie were truly the person who needed to be heard. "I need silence to guide the cockpit through the sequence," Annie said. "And I need Victor to stop interrupting me." Victor's face flushed crimson. "You don't have the authority to give orders here." Richard looked at him. "Right now, she does." Annie wedged the flashlight under her chin and reached deeper into the wiring bundle. The gray cable felt warmer than usual. Not scalding yet, but enough to signal trouble. Serious trouble. She traced it to a small junction, half obscured by a metal clip. The label had faded, but the routing matched the notebook diagram perfectly. Annie touched the clip. A tiny blue spark snapped against her fingertip. She jerked her hand back, not out of fear, but surprise. Victor instantly seized the opportunity. "That's enough. Pull her out. She isn't saving anything." "No," Annie said, flexing her fingers slightly. "I found it." Richard leaned down closer. "Found what?" Annie looked at the cable vibrating in its bracket, then at the controller still flashing in its erratic cycle. "A ghost signal," she said. "There's something in this line lying to the system." Right then, the plane pitched forward again, harder than before. The words left Annie's mouth and seemed to hang in the open hatch. The ghost signal. Above her, no one asked what that meant at first. They were too busy listening to the aircraft. The jet was no longer falling in one clean drop. It was fighting itself in ugly corrections. Nose lowering, lifting, lowering again, while the wind outside shoved against the fuselage with steady force. The cabin creaked. The floor trembled under every foot. Richard crouched beside the hatch with Samuel Carter's notebook open against his knee. "What does that mean?" Annie kept the flashlight trained on the gray cable. "It means the core system thinks it's receiving a real command, but it isn't. It's a false signal repeating through the weather feed line and pushing the backup response out of sync." Victor let out a breath through his teeth. "You're making that up as you go." Annie did not look at him. "No, I'm reading what the airplane is doing. It's a jet, not a patient on a table. It's acting like one." Kyle, the younger technician, leaned closer to his tablet. His face changed as he compared the data against what Annie was saying. "Wait," he muttered. Victor turned on him. "Don't." Kyle swallowed but did not stop looking. "The auxiliary feed is spiking before each failed correction. It's small, but it's there." Richard looked at Victor. "Did you see that?" Victor's mouth tightened. "It's noise. You get noise in high wind. It doesn't mean the system is lying." Annie reached into the tight space again, careful not to touch the exposed point where the spark had snapped. "Then why does the loop fire every time this line pulses?" Victor said nothing fast enough. That delay gave everyone in the cabin something worse than fear. Doubt. Not doubt about Annie. Doubt about the man who had been telling them she was dangerous. The man in the gray suit leaned into the aisle. His face had lost the sharp confidence he wore at takeoff. "Mr. Hayes, can you confirm she's wrong?" Victor glared at him. "Sir, I'm trying to keep this aircraft intact." "That's not what I asked." The woman with the red scarf clutched the armrests, eyes fixed on the open floor. "If she found something, let her work." A few minutes earlier, the same woman had begged Richard not to let Annie touch anything. Annie heard the change but took no comfort from it. Fear could turn against you, or toward you. Either way, it was still fear. The captain's voice came through again. "Mr. Whitmore, we have degraded response on both stabilizers. I'm compensating manually, but the control lag is getting worse. Whatever you're doing, do it now." Richard looked down at Annie. "Tell me exactly what you need." Annie shifted her weight and wedged her left shoulder against the frame to keep from sliding as the jet rocked. "I need to isolate the gray cable from the junction node without killing the main bus. Then the cockpit needs to stop forcing resets. No more override attempts unless I call for it." Victor snapped. "Absolutely not. If we stop the resets, we lose what little correction we have. No, Annie said. You stop feeding the bad rhythm. You let the system go quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds? Richard asked. If the false signal drops, the core can hear the primary command again. But if the backup keeps shouting over it, nothing clears. Richard stared at the notebook. Is that in here? Page after that one. He flipped too fast and tore the corner of a page. Annie saw it and felt a sting that had nothing to do with the cable. Careful. Richard froze. His eyes lifted to hers. For once he did not bark back. He turned the page more slowly. There it was. Samuel Carter's handwriting, slanted and tight, beside a diagram of a looped control path. When everyone is yelling at the core, silence becomes a tool. Richard read it aloud, his voice quieter at the end than at the start. Victor shook his head. With respect, Mr. Whitmore, I am not grounding my judgment in a dead man's scribbles. Annie looked up then. The compartment light caught her face from below, and for a second the cabin saw the anger she had been holding under control since Victor shoved her away from the panel. Don't call my father's work scribbles. Victor's eyes narrowed. Then don't bring a family keepsake into an aircraft emergency and expect professionals to treat it like a manual. It became an emergency because professionals stopped questioning the manual. The cabin went still except for the alarms and the hard push of wind against the windows. Richard's voice cut in. Enough. Annie, can you isolate it? I think so. Think so? She held his gaze. You want the truth or comfort? That landed harder than she meant it to. Richard looked away first. Truth. I can isolate it if the clamp hasn't fused. If it has, I'll need to cut the shield, separate the feed, and bridge the main line by hand, long enough for the cockpit to reset the core. Kyle's face went pale. By hand? Annie nodded once. Victor nearly laughed. That would put live current through the shield. Not if I separate the ground first. And if you miss? Annie glanced at the gray cable. Then I get burned. Richard's expression changed. How badly? That depends on how much the system hates me. Nobody smiled. Eleanor Grant leaned toward the hatch. Her voice was steady, but Annie could hear the strain in it. Annie, look at me a moment. Annie did. You don't owe anyone on this plane a performance. You understand me? You don't have to prove your worth to people who were too frightened to see it. Annie swallowed. Ma'am, this isn't about proving anything. I know, Eleanor said. That's why I trust you more than the ones arguing. Victor turned away with a hard shake of his head. But Richard kept looking at Eleanor. He seemed to recognize something in her tone. The kind of authority that did not come from wealth or job titles. It came from having survived rooms where people tried to make truth sound unreasonable. The aircraft lurched left. Annie's knee slammed into the bracket. She bit back a cry and grabbed the cable bundle before her body slid deeper into the bay. Richard reached instinctively toward the hatch. Annie? I'm fine. She was not fine, but fine was the only answer that kept people from pulling her out. Kyle crouched at the edge, ignoring Victor now. What tool do you need? Annie looked at him. Insulated cutters. Smallest pair you have. And a grounding strap, if there is one. Kyle grabbed the maintenance kit and handed items down. Victor caught his wrist. You assist her? And you're answering for it. Kyle looked at Victor, then at the flashing red screen, then at Annie wedged inside the floor trying to save them all. If we live, I'll answer. He released the tools. Annie took them with a nod. Thank you. The cutters barely fit between the harness and the sidewall. She worked by feel as much as sight, easing the tip under the damaged shielding. The wire pulsed again. The control housing answered with that same trapped rhythm. 3 beats. Catch. 3 beats. She could hear her father in the garage. Don't chase the loudest part, Annie. The loudest part is usually the complaint. Find the cause. She peeled back the shielding. A tiny black mark scarred the underside of the gray cable, where it had rubbed against a metal clamp. Not enough to fail cleanly. Enough to bleed a lie into the system every time the aircraft flexed under wind load. There, she said. Richard leaned closer. What? It's chafed. The cable's touching the clamp when the fuselage flexes. That's the pulse. That's the ghost signal. Kyle checked his tablet. That matches the spike timing. Victor's confidence cracked for a second, and this time everyone saw it. The captain came on again. 10,000 feet. Control lag is worsening. Annie clipped the grounding strap to the frame, then to the tool. Her burned fingertip throbbed. Sweat ran down her temple. The compartment seemed smaller now, the air hotter. "I'm going to separate the feed," she said. "When I tell you, cockpit stops all resets." 3 seconds of silence. Then primary command only. Richard lifted the phone. "Captain, did you hear that?" "I heard." Victor pushed forward. "Captain, do not accept instructions from—" Richard turned on him. "Victor, if you speak over her again, I'll have you removed from this channel." Victor stared at him. "You would trust her over me?" Richard looked down into the hatch, at Annie's torn sleeve, her steady hands, the old notebook open on his knee, and the red warning light washing over all of them. "I'm trusting the person still giving me answers." Annie placed the cutters around the damaged shield. The cable snapped a blue spark into the air before she even closed the blades. Pain shot up her hand, sharp and bright. She sucked in a breath, but held position. Eleanor whispered, "Hold on, Annie." Annie closed her eyes for half a second, not to escape the pain, but to hear the rhythm one more time. 3 beats. Catch. There. She squeezed the cutters. The cut did not free the cable cleanly. The outer shield split, but the damaged strand inside clung to the clamp with a thin thread of melted insulation. A blue spark jumped again, brighter this time, and bit across Annie's knuckles. Her hand jerked back. Pain ran up her arm so fast her vision blurred. Above her, Eleanor said, "Annie, I'm still here." Annie forced the words out through her teeth. Her fingers trembled. She hated that. Not the pain, not even the fear, but the trembling. Her father used to say the hand was honest before the mouth was. If the hand shook, respect it, then make it work anyway. Victor leaned over the hatch, his voice tight with triumph. "She's injured. Pull her out before she shorts the entire bay." Kyle looked from Victor to Annie. The spike dropped for half a second. Victor snapped. "Half a second doesn't save an aircraft. It proves she found the right line," Kyle said. Richard turned toward the cockpit speaker. "Captain," the answer came with a burst of static. "We saw a brief correction. Controls answered cleaner, then fell back into lag. Whatever she touched affected the fault." Annie drew a breath and looked at the cable again. "It's fused to the clamp. I need to separate it all the way." Kyle opened the toolkit wider. "Ceramic pick? Too brittle. It'll snap." "Insulated pliers?" "No room." Victor laughed once. "Listen to this. Now she's shopping for tools while we're dropping." Annie looked up at him. "Do you have a better idea?" Victor's jaw worked, but nothing came. Richard saw it again. The pause. The empty space where confidence used to stand. He wiped sweat from his upper lip and looked around the cabin. No one was asking about Miami anymore. No one mentioned the signing, the billion-dollar deal, the cameras waiting at the hotel, or the private cars on the tarmac. They listened to the open floor because the truth had moved there. The investor who had argued against Annie leaned forward. "How much altitude do we have?" The captain answered before anyone else could. 9,000. Descent continues, but we're trying to reduce the rate. The woman in the red scarf closed her eyes. 9,000 sounds high. The gray suit man shook his head. Not in an airplane that won't answer. Annie heard them but kept her eyes on the line. The gray cable pulsed faintly against the clamp. It was not dead. It was whispering the same lie into the core, and the aircraft kept believing it. She reached for her father's notebook. "Richard, turn to the page after the loop diagram." Richard flipped carefully this time. The earlier torn corner was tucked under his thumb as if he feared doing more damage. "I'm there. Bottom note." He found it. His voice was uneven as he read. "If the shield welds to frame contact, do not pull against the harness. Remove the frame's voice before removing the wire." Victor frowned. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means isolate the clamp," Annie said. "The cable isn't the only problem. The clamp is becoming part of the circuit." Kyle leaned over his tablet, then looked down into the compartment. "That would explain the irregular pulse when the aircraft flexes." Victor glared at him. "You're very eager to agree with her." Kyle did not look away this time. "I'm eager not to die pretending she's wrong." The sentence struck the cabin silent. Richard lowered the notebook. The look he gave Kyle was brief, but it mattered. It was the first time one of Victor's own men had stepped fully out of line. Annie reached toward the clamp. I need the ground strap moved from the tool to the clamp bracket. Then I need the cockpit to stop all resets on my mark. Victor stepped closer. If you isolate that bracket and she slips, you can create a pressure cascade. Annie froze for half a breath. The word pressure moved through the cabin like a threat people could understand. The red scarf woman opened her eyes. The gray suit man gripped his seat. Richard looked at Annie. Is that true? Annie did not answer too quickly. That would have been pride. And pride was what had trapped them here. It's possible, she said. If I bridge the wrong contact. Victor seized on it. There, she admits it. Annie continued. But the pressure system isn't what I'm touching. It's adjacent. That's why I need the bracket grounded before I separate the line. Richard stared at her, searching for certainty she refused to fake. You can do it? I can do it if no one rushes me. The jet dropped suddenly, stealing the last word from her mouth. Her shoulder slammed into the control housing. The flashlight slipped, clattered against a bracket, and went dark. For a second, Annie was blind. The cabin above erupted at once. Someone shouted for lights. Victor cursed. Kyle scrambled for another flashlight. Annie kept one hand flat on the frame and the other away from the cable. Blind hands guessed. Guessing killed. Don't move, she shouted. Everyone stopped, even Victor. Her own voice surprised her. It had sounded like her father's for a second, firm and low, not asking to be believed. Kyle clicked on a spare light and lowered it down. The beam swept across Annie's face. She blinked once and nodded. Hold it steady. I've got you, Kyle said. Victor said nothing. Annie reached for the grounding strap. The metal clip slipped against her burned fingers. Pain made her breath hitch. But she pressed the clip open and locked it. The pulse changed immediately. It did not stop, but it thinned, as if the lie had lost part of its voice. Kyle checked the tablet. Spike amplitude just dropped. Richard leaned closer. English, Kyle. It got weaker. The captain came through. We felt that. Control lag narrowed for 2 seconds. Annie did not celebrate. It'll come back unless I separate the fused strand. Richard looked at the passengers. They were listening to technical language now, like people in church listening for a verdict. He wondered, with a shame that arrived too late to be useful, how many times Annie had spoken in his office and been treated like background noise. Do what you need, he said. Victor muttered. This is madness, Eleanor answered before Richard could. No, Mr. Hayes. Madness is ignoring the person who keeps being right. Victor looked back at her, but Eleanor did not lower her eyes. She had spent too many years staring down men who confused volume with authority. Annie took the ceramic pick after all, not to pry the cable, but to hold back the surrounding insulation. With her injured hand braced against the frame, she slid the cutters into the narrow gap and angled them toward the fused strand. Captain, she said, on my mark, stop all resets. Count 3 seconds. Then primary command only. No backup override. Victor started. Captain, I advise. Richard cut him off. Victor, one word. Enough. The captain answered, standing by. The aircraft rocked again under the force of the wind. Annie waded through it. She could not fight the movement. She had to move with it. That was another lesson from her father. Never wrestle a machine bigger than you. Learn its rhythm, then work in the space it gives you. The cable pulsed. 3 beats. A catch. Annie slid the cutters deeper. Another pulse. Her burned hand screamed. Annie, Richard said, quieter than before. Not now. He shut his mouth. The next pulse came. The fused strand lifted a fraction off the clamp. Annie saw the opening. Mark, she shouted. The cockpit cut the resets. For 3 seconds, the aircraft seemed to hold its breath. 1. The alarm still wailed. 2. The pulse in the cable faded. 3. Annie squeezed. The fused strand snapped free with a sharp crack and a flash of blue light. Above her, the cabin lights flickered once. Then the red warning on the diagnostic screen changed. Core loop interrupted. Primary command searching. Kyle stared. It's searching. Richard gripped the hatch. Is that good? Annie pressed her burned hand against her shirt. and looked at the control housing. The old rhythm was gone, but the system had not recovered yet. It was awake, confused, waiting for one clean command. "It's not enough," she said. The captain came on, voice urgent. "We have primary channel response, but it's unstable. Altitude 8,000. I need the next step." Victor looked down at her, stunned into silence. Annie reached for the notebook with her good hand. She knew the next step before she saw it, but she needed the page because her father's words steadied her more than memory alone. Richard lowered the notebook into view. Samuel Carter's handwriting sat under a final diagram. "Once the false signal is starved, wake the core gently. Force will restart the loop." Annie read it, then looked toward the cockpit door. "No hard reset," she said. "We have to wake it soft." "Wake it soft?" Richard repeated. Annie kept her eyes on the control housing. The old pulse had stopped, but the silence inside the system was not peace. It was a stunned pause, the kind that came after a hard hit, when a body had not yet decided whether to breathe again. "No forced reset," she said. "No override. No backup command unless I ask for it. The core is searching for a clean signal. If the cockpit shoves too much at it, it'll lock again." The captain answered from the speaker. "Tell me what to enter." Annie wiped sweat from her upper lip with the back of her wrist, then regretted it when the burned skin touched her face. She inhaled through her teeth. The pain was getting louder. She pushed it down, not away, just down far enough to work around it. "Richard," she said, "read the next line." He looked at the notebook. His voice had changed since the first time he read from it. Less command, more care. "Manual primary wake requires staggered input. Flight surface trim neutral. Weather feed hold. Backup channel asleep for 5 seconds. Victor stepped forward. "Backup asleep? If the primary fails, they'll have nothing." "If backup stays awake," Annie said, "it argues with the primary before the primary can stand up." Victor shook his head. "That is not how we phrase aircraft recovery." "No," Annie said. "That's how my father explained it to a girl at a kitchen table so she would remember it when men like you made the room too loud." Kyle's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the tablet. He did not smile, but something in his face settled into respect. The captain came through. "I can set trim neutral manually, but weather feed hold is not staying engaged from the cockpit." Annie looked at the gray cable in the junction node. The false signal had been cut, but the weather feed circuit still ran through the same bay. If the cockpit could not hold it, she would have to do it from below. "Give me the weather hold relay location," she said. Victor answered out of habit, then stopped himself. Kyle spoke before him. "Forward side of the housing. Small green switch under a protective tab." Annie shifted deeper into the compartment. Her right hand was almost useless now, stiff and pulsing. She used her left to move the flashlight, then tucked it between 2 cable bundles so the beam lit the front of the housing. There it was, a small green switch behind a clear guard. She reached for it. The jet rocked, and her fingers missed, hitting the side of the housing. A dull shock ran through her elbow. Not electrical this time, just impact. But it made her bite her lip hard enough to taste blood. "Annie," Eleanor called. "I'm all right. You keep saying that like it makes it true." Despite everything, Annie almost laughed. It came out as a breath. "My mama says the same thing." The red scarf woman, still pale, leaned toward the aisle. "What's your mother's name?" Annie did not know why the question landed the way it did. Maybe because it was the first normal thing anyone had asked since the alarms began. Maybe because it reminded her that the world below still existed. Kitchens, night shifts, unpaid bills, bus stops, church ladies who kept peppermints in their purses. "Denise," Annie said. The woman swallowed. "Then let's get you home to Denise." Annie nodded once and reached again. This time she found the protective tab. It was stiff. Her burned hand could not help. She pressed with her left thumb, but the tab refused to release. "It's stuck," she said. Kyle leaned lower. "There's a safety catch on the underside. I can't see it. Feel under the lip, 1/4 inch from the right." Annie slid her finger under the guard. The aircraft trembled. The catch was small, slick with condensation or oil, and set at an angle she could barely reach. She pressed. Nothing. The captain's voice sharpened. "Altitude 7,000. Descent rate fluctuating. Primary response is fading. Victor spoke again, but not as loud this time. If she can't open it, we have to bring backup back online. No, Annie said. Not yet. We are running out of altitude. I know where we are. You do not. You're under the floor with a flashlight and an old notebook. Annie stopped moving. The words should not have mattered. There were worse things happening. But the contempt in them found an old bruise. She thought of her father at the dining table, writing letters nobody answered. She thought of him coming home from interviews with his tie loosened and his smile too careful. She thought of the way he kept teaching her anyway, as if the world's refusal to listen did not excuse him from telling the truth. Her voice came low. That old notebook is the reason you're still arguing. Victor said nothing. Richard did. Open the relay, Annie. She pressed the catch again. Her thumb slipped. Eleanor's voice came down to her, calm and firm. Slow your hand, child. Don't chase the fear. Annie closed her eyes. Her father had said it differently. Fear gets loud, truth stays quiet. Either way, the lesson was the same. She let the aircraft rock. She felt the movement through her shoulder, hip, knee, and palm. The jet pushed left. She waited. It settled half an inch right. In that small space, she pressed the catch upward and slid the tab free. The green switch exposed itself. Got it, she said. Kyle's breath rushed out. Good. Hold relay down for 5 seconds after cockpit neutral. Annie looked toward Richard. Captain sets trim neutral first. Then I hold weather feed. Then backup sleeps. Then he sends primary wake. Low input only. Richard repeated it into the phone, stumbling once over the words but getting them right. The captain answered, ready. For a moment, the cabin arranged itself around Annie's voice. Richard knelt by the hatch with the notebook. Kyle held the light. Eleanor steadied herself with one hand on the seat and watched the girl below, as if watching history decide whether to be cruel or kind. Even Victor stood still. Annie placed her thumb on the green switch. Captain, neutral trim on my count. 3, 2, 1, now. Neutral set. Annie pressed the switch down. Weather hold engaged. Kyle watched the tablet. Feed stable. Backup asleep, Annie said. The captain replied. Backup channel sleeping. The cabin lights dimmed for a second. Someone whimpered. Annie counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Primary wake, she said. Low input. Do not push it. The captain's voice came softer, as if he understood the machine now needed gentleness more than force. Sending primary wake. The control housing clicked. Once, twice, then nothing. Annie's thumb stayed on the relay. Her burned hand throbbed against her chest. The silence stretched too long. Richard whispered, "What's happening?" Annie listened. At first, she heard only wind against the fuselage and alarms. Then, beneath it, a new rhythm began. Not the trapped 3 beats. Not the catch. Not the lie repeating itself. A steady hum moved through the housing. Kyle stared at the tablet. Primary channel is responding. The captain came on immediately. I have partial control. Stabilizer response improving. A sound moved through the cabin. Not quite relief. Not yet. People had been too frightened to trust good news quickly. Annie released the relay. The green switch stayed down. Then the screen changed again. Primary command active. Core loop cleared. Backup channel standby. Kyle looked at Victor, then at Richard. She cleared it. The jet leveled for half a breath, then dipped again. Not as violently as before, but enough to remind everyone they were not saved yet. The captain's voice cut through. We have control, but we've lost too much altitude. I need engine response stabilized now, or we won't climb. Richard looked down at Annie. What does that mean? Annie looked at the notebook, then at the cable she had cut, then at the control housing now awake but weakened. It means the brain is back, she said, but the body still has to move. Annie stayed where she was, half inside the control bay, half under the weight of what the captain had just said. The brain was back. The body still had to move. Above her, Richard repeated the words as if they belonged to another language. Engine response? I thought she fixed the system. Kyle checked the tablet with one hand while holding the flashlight with the other. Flight control is back, but the engines aren't spooling evenly. The core loop probably disrupted the throttle management sequence. Victor leaned closer, seizing the chance to reclaim authority. That's exactly why we should bring the full backup channel online and let the aircraft stabilize itself. Annie snapped her head up. No. Victor's face tightened. You don't get to keep saying no. If you wake the full backup while throttle management is out of sync, it may read the left engine as stable and overcorrect the right. That's how you get a yaw we can't recover from at this altitude. Kyle looked down at the screen, then at Victor. She's right. Right engine response is lagging. Victor's eyes flashed. Stop saying that. Kyle did not back down this time. Stop making it necessary. The cabin heard him. Even through the alarms, even through the rush of wind and the strained hum of the engines, the sentence landed. Victor Hayes had spent the flight standing in front of everyone, speaking like certainty itself. Now one of his own technicians was refusing to pretend. The captain came on. I need a stable climb profile. Right engine is not matching command. We're at 6,800 feet and still sinking. The woman with the red scarf made a small sound and pressed her fingers to her mouth. The man in the gray suit stared at the ceiling as though numbers might become mercy if he looked long enough. The investor turned toward Richard again. But this time he did not demand anything. He looked smaller now, his anger worn down by fear. Richard crouched by the hatch. Annie, can you fix that from where you are? Annie looked at the control housing, then followed the cable run toward the aft side of the compartment. The throttle management relay was not in the same box. It was farther back, behind a service cover she could barely reach from her current position. I need to get deeper, Victor said. No, absolutely not. That area is tighter, hotter, and if she gets stuck down there, we lose access to the bay, Annie said. If the engines don't answer together, access won't matter. Richard closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. What do you need? A smaller light. And someone has to hold my ankles when the jet rolls. No one spoke for a moment. Then Eleanor Grant stepped forward. Victor stared at her. Ma'am, you need to remain seated. Eleanor gave him a look that could have made a courtroom clerk sit straighter. I spent 35 years standing when men told me to sit. I will manage. Richard reached out. Miss Grant, please, let someone else. I'm not going into the hole, Mr. Whitmore. I'm holding the girl steady. The red scarf woman unbuckled halfway, then stopped when the jet shifted. I can help too. Annie glanced up, surprised despite herself. The woman swallowed. I was wrong before. I was scared. That doesn't excuse it, but I can hold a flashlight. The apology was awkward and incomplete, but it was real enough for the moment they were in. Annie nodded. Thank you. Kyle handed down a penlight and clipped another small tool to Annie's sleeve. Throttle relay cover has 2 quarter-turn fasteners. Left one may be stripped. Don't force it. Got it. Victor muttered. This is insane. Richard did not look at him. You said you had no options, Victor. She keeps finding them. Annie slid forward. The compartment narrowed around her ribs. Metal scraped her shoulder. Heat gathered near her face. Eleanor braced her feet against the base of a seat and took hold of Annie's ankles with both hands, firm but careful. Tell me if I hurt you, Eleanor said. You won't. Child. You don't know that. Annie almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. The penlight showed her a service plate mounted at an angle behind the control housing. 2 fasteners. Kyle had been right. The left one was damaged, the slot chewed up from some old maintenance job no one had cared to record properly. She pressed the tool into the right fastener and turned. It came loose. The left one refused. The captain's voice came again. 6,000 feet. The number moved through the cabin like cold water. Annie reset the tool and tried again. The fastener slipped. Victor said, She can't open it. Annie ignored him. She changed the angle, braced her burned hand despite the pain, and pressed harder. Her palm screamed. She had to stop for half a breath. Eleanor tightened her grip around Annie's ankles. Slow is smooth. Annie exhaled. Smooth is fast, she finished. My husband used to say that, Eleanor said. Before every road trip, every leaky sink, every stubborn lawnmower, Annie kept working. Sounds like he was right. Not always, Eleanor said. But enough that I married him. The small exchange steadied the cabin in a strange way. For a few seconds, the people above were not only passengers on a failing aircraft, They were Americans who had fixed things in garages, argued over directions, lost husbands, raised daughters, and learned that panic never tightened a bolt. The fastener shifted. Annie turned it slowly until the plate came free. Behind it sat a row of relays. 3 black, 1 white, 1 amber. The amber relay clicked out of rhythm with the engine vibration. "There," Annie whispered. Kyle leaned down. "What do you see?" "Throttle sync relay, amber housing. It's cycling late." Kyle checked his tablet. "Right engine lag matches that relay." Victor pushed forward. "That relay is not serviceable in flight." Annie looked at the amber housing. "It doesn't need service. It needs to be reset after the core wake." "How?" She did not answer immediately because the answer was in her father's notebook, but not as a procedure. It was one of Samuel Carter's kitchen table fixes, the kind of thing a man wrote when he knew the official world would not listen. Richard had the notebook ready. "What page?" "Blue tab, near the back." He flipped. "There's a sketch of 3 relays. Read the note under the amber one." Richard bent closer to the page. "If throttle sync lags after core recovery, do not cycle engine command. Break the relay memory. Then let both engines relearn idle together." Kyle whispered, "Relay memory." Victor said, "That is not an aviation term." "No," Annie said. "It's a father explaining a stubborn machine to his daughter." Richard looked at the amber relay. "How do you break the memory?" Annie reached for it with the pen light between her teeth, then stopped. "There's a manual release pin on the underside. I need to hold it while the captain brings both throttles to idle command, then slowly advances them together." The captain answered at once. "I can do that." Victor said, "That could flame out the right engine." Annie shook her head as much as the tight space allowed. "Not if the fuel feed stays stable." Kyle checked. "Fuel feed is stable." Victor glared. "You're willing to stake your life on her notebook?" Kyle looked at Annie's burned hand, then toward the passengers holding their breath. "I'm staking it on the data that keeps proving her notebook right." Richard lifted the phone. "Captain, prepare to bring both engines to idle command on Annie's mark." "Standing by." Annie slid her fingers under the amber relay. The release pin was smaller than she expected. Her burned hand could not reach it at the angle she needed, so she used her left. The pin resisted. "Annie?" Richard asked. "Don't talk." He stopped. The aircraft rolled. Eleanor held Annie's ankles tight. The red scarf woman kept the flashlight steady, though her hands shook. Kyle watched the tablet. Victor stood silent, finally outnumbered by people choosing usefulness over pride. Annie pressed the pin. It clicked halfway. Not enough. She shifted deeper, shoulder wedged against a hot pipe guard. The edge bit into her skin. She pressed again. The pin clicked fully. "Now," she said. The captain pulled both throttle commands to idle. For one awful second, the engine softened. The cabin heard it. Every passenger heard it. The sound of power reducing while the sea waited below. The gray suit man whispered, "No. No. No." Annie held the pin and counted. 1. Tfo. The amber relay went silent. "Advance together," Annie said. The captain moved the throttles. The left engine answered first. The right engine hesitated. Victor sucked in a breath. Then the amber relay clicked once, clean and centered. The right engine rose to match. Kyle stared at the screen. "They're sinking." The captain's voice came through, stronger now. "Engine response stabilizing. I have climb power." The jet's nose lifted, not sharply, but with purpose. The pressure pushed through the cabin as the aircraft began to climb. A sound broke from the passengers, half sob, half prayer. Annie kept holding the pin until Kyle said, "Relay is locked. You can let go." She released it. Her hand fell against the compartment floor. Richard leaned over the hatch. "Annie?" She closed her eyes, listening. No trapped rhythm, no catch, no lie. Only the hard, steady work of engines trying to carry them home. For several seconds, nobody dared to trust the climb. The cabin stayed braced for another drop, another alarm, another red warning that would tear the relief out of their hands. Annie stayed still beneath the floor, eyes closed, cheek pressed near the warm metal frame, listening to the engine's work. The sound was not perfect. A wounded machine never sounded perfect right away. But the rhythm had changed. It was no longer fighting itself. It was climbing. The captain's voice came through the speaker. "Altitude increasing. Passing 60, 200 feet. Engine response stable. Flight controls responding on primary channel. The woman with the red scarf began to cry. Not loudly. Just a small broken sound she tried to hide behind her hand. The man in the gray suit leaned back against his seat and covered his eyes. The investor who had shouted at Annie earlier sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if gratitude had arrived before his pride knew what to do with it. Richard Whitmore remained crouched by the hatch. For once, he did not speak first. He stared down into the narrow dark where Annie lay, half-twisted beside the control housing, her blazer torn, one hand curled against her chest, the other resting on the compartment floor. "Annie," he said. She opened her eyes. "Is the right engine still matching?" Kyle checked the tablet. "Within range. Better than range. It's holding. The weather feed? Stable. Backup channel? Standby. Not fighting primary." Only then did Annie let out the breath she had been holding. Eleanor Grant squeezed Annie's ankle gently before letting go. "You hear that, child?" "The plane's climbing." Annie nodded. But she did not move yet. Her body had gone heavy in that cramped space, as if every muscle had waited until the emergency passed to remind her what she had done to it. Her palm burned, her shoulder throbbed, her knees ached from bracing against brackets and cold rails. Victor Hayes stepped closer to the hatch. He looked smaller now, though nothing about his body had changed. The headset still circled his ear. His uniform was still neat. His title still existed, but the voice he had used to fill the cabin had lost its weight. "We still need to secure the bay," he said. Kyle looked up at him. "I can do it." Victor's eyes moved to him. That wasn't a suggestion. Richard stood slowly. He had to steady himself on the seat as the jet continued climbing through rough air. "No. Kyle secures it. You step back." Victor stiffened. "Mr. Whitmore, I am responsible for this aircraft." Richard looked at him, and the look carried every second of fear Victor had failed to answer. "You were responsible 10 minutes ago, too." The cabin went quiet again. Victor's face flushed. "Sir, with respect, I followed procedure." "And when procedure failed?" Victor did not answer. Richard turned away from him. "Kyle, help her out when it's safe." Kyle nodded. "Yes, sir." Annie shifted her elbow and winced. Eleanor heard it. "Don't rush her. I'm fine," Annie said. Eleanor gave a short, dry laugh. "You are a terrible liar." That drew a small sound from the red scarf woman, almost a laugh and almost a sob. The cabin needed that sound. It reminded them they were still alive enough for ordinary human things. Kyle lowered himself partway into the hatch and clipped a temporary insulating sleeve around the separated gray line. He secured the freed strand away from the clamp, then checked the amber relay. His hands moved fast, but not carelessly. Annie watched him. "Don't reseat the backup channel until the captain is level." "I know." Victor made a sharp movement as if to interrupt, but Richard glanced at him once, and he stopped. The captain spoke again. "We're diverting to Charleston. We're not continuing to Miami. I repeat, emergency landing in Charleston. Estimated time 22 minutes if systems hold." Systems hold. The words moved through Annie's mind with no promise attached. She knew enough not to celebrate too soon. A loop cleared did not erase what had been damaged. A relay reset did not make the aircraft new. They had won time, not certainty. Richard looked down at her. "You heard the captain. We're going to land." Annie reached for the side rail and tried to pull herself back toward the hatch. Pain shot through her burned hand, and her arm gave out. Kyle caught her under the shoulder. "Easy. I can climb. Maybe. But you don't have to." The sentence stopped her more than the pain did. You don't have to. People like Annie were used to having to prove, having to carry, having to stay polite when insulted, having to be twice as careful and still blamed first. Her father used to come home exhausted and still wash the dishes because her mother had been on her feet all day. Her mother used to say pride did not pay rent, but dignity was not for sale. Annie had learned early that help often came with a hook hidden inside it. Kyle's hand did not feel like a hook. It felt like help. She let him guide her up. When Annie's head rose above the cabin floor, the passengers saw her differently. not because she had changed. That was the uncomfortable part. She was the same girl who had walked forward gripping seatbacks while they told Richard not to let her near the system. Same badge, same cheap blazer, same young face smudged with dust and sweat. Only their eyes had changed. The red scarf woman stood as far as her seatbelt allowed. "Your hand," she said. Annie looked down. The skin across her palm and 2 fingers was red and beginning to blister. A strip of Eleanor's handkerchief, now marked with oil and blood, clung loosely to her wrist. "I'll need ice," Annie said, because anything bigger felt too hard to say. The woman unbuckled and moved toward the galley. "I'll get it," Victor snapped. "Passengers remain seated until the captain clears movement." The woman stopped, then looked at Richard. Richard said, "Get the ice." She did. The investor leaned forward. He looked at Annie, then away, then back again. "Miss Carter." Annie turned. His face tightened around the words. "I was wrong. It was not enough. It was not supposed to be enough." But it was more than most frightened men managed while the aircraft was still in the air. Annie nodded once. "You were scared. That's not an excuse." "No, sir, it isn't." He accepted that. His gaze dropped. The man in the gray suit spoke next, voice rough. "When I said our lives shouldn't be in your hands." Annie waited. He swallowed. "I'm glad they were." Eleanor's eyes softened, but she did not rescue him from the discomfort. Some shame had to be carried by the person who earned it. Richard watched all of this without speaking. The old Richard would have taken control of the moment, turned it into a statement, a promise, an order. This Richard seemed to understand that he had no right to own what had happened. The red scarf woman returned with ice wrapped in a towel. She placed it carefully around Annie's hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I looked at you and thought you couldn't know. I don't have a good reason." Annie met her eyes. "Most people don't." That hurt the woman. It was meant to. Not cruelly, but honestly. The captain's voice returned. "Cabin, prepare for emergency landing. We have control, but systems remain compromised. Everyone seated and belted. Maintenance, secure all open panels." Kyle guided Annie to the nearest seat, not the one in the back. It was a forward-facing seat beside the open hatch, close enough that she could hear the control bay if it changed again. Victor reached for the panel cover. Annie said, "Don't close it fully." He froze. She continued, "Latch it halfway. Leave access in case the relay slips during descent." Victor looked at Richard. Richard did not hesitate. "Do what she said." Victor's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. The act was small. To anyone else, it might have looked like simple compliance. To Annie, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood long before she boarded this jet. She sank into the seat. Eleanor took the place across from her and fastened her belt. "You did well," Eleanor said. Annie looked down at the ice around her hand. "We haven't landed." "No," Eleanor said, "but don't throw away the truth just because the story isn't finished." Annie looked toward the window. The clouds had thinned enough for light to press through in pale strips. Far below, the Atlantic was no longer rushing up at them. It was still there, wide and indifferent, but it had lost its claim. Richard sat 2 rows away, still holding Samuel Carter's notebook. He had not returned it yet. He ran his thumb along the worn edge as if he had only begun to understand what it weighed. "Annie," he said quietly. She turned. "Your father," Richard said. "Was he an engineer?" Annie's face changed before she could stop it. The cabin waited. "Yes," she said. "He was." Richard looked down at the notebook again. "Then when we land, I want to know his name." Annie held his gaze, and for the first time since the jet began falling, something in her chest hurt worse than her hand. "Samuel Carter," she said. Richard repeated it carefully. Samuel Carter. Not Sam, not her father, not whoever wrote the notes. Samuel Carter. The name entered the cabin like someone long locked outside had finally been allowed through the door. The captain came on once more. Beginning descent into Charleston. Annie leaned back, ice pressed to her burned hand, and listened. The engines held. The descent into Charleston did not feel like a rescue at first. It felt like another test. The jet had stopped falling, but no one mistook that for safety. The cabin remained tight with held breath. People sat belted in seats they had not chosen. Hands clamped around armrests, eyes moving between the windows, the cockpit door, and Annie. The engines held their new rhythm, but every small vibration traveled through the cabin like a question. Annie kept her burned hand wrapped in the towel of ice. The cold helped for a minute, then hurt in a different way. She accepted that. Pain meant her hand was still there, still hers, still attached to a body that had not gone into the Atlantic. Richard sat 2 rows forward with Samuel Carter's notebook on his lap. He had closed it, but his hand stayed on top of it, palm flat, as if the cover might open by itself and accuse him. Victor Hayes remained near the half-latched panel. He did not sit. He checked the diagnostic tablet again and again, though the numbers no longer obeyed his pride. Kyle stood beside him, calmer now, watching the relay data Annie had told them not to ignore. The captain's voice came through. "Cabin, we're descending through 4,000 feet. Charleston approach has us on emergency priority. Fire and medical crews will meet us on the runway. Keep everyone seated." The woman with the red scarf whispered, 4,000. The man in the gray suit answered without looking at her. "That sounds better than 9. "It does," she said, then looked toward Annie. "Doesn't it?" Annie listened before answering. The engines were still matched. The right side dragged a fraction under load, but the amber relay caught and corrected without snapping back into the old lag. "It sounds better," she said. Richard turned. "But not good? Good enough to land if nothing else changes." No one liked the second half of that sentence, but no one argued with it. Eleanor Grant sat across from Annie, one hand resting on her own seatbelt, the other folded over the armrest. She had the composed look of a woman who understood fear but refused to give it the dignity of running the room. "You always answer that way?" Eleanor asked. "What way, ma'am?" "With the part people want and the part they don't." Annie looked at the ice around her hand. "My father said comfort is only useful after the truth has done its work." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Your father sounds like a man who paid for telling it." Annie's throat tightened. She did not answer. Richard heard the silence. He looked down at the notebook again. Was he with an aircraft company? Annie's eyes stayed on the half-latched panel. He was with more than one. Mostly contract work. Design, review, failure mapping, control logic. Jobs that needed his brain, but not his name. Richard absorbed that. What does that mean? It means they called him when something didn't make sense, then forgot him when it was time to put names on the report. Kyle glanced over. Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Richard lowered his eyes. "And the core system loop?" Annie gave a small nod. "He warned about it. Not this exact aircraft, not this exact setup, but the behavior. A system caught between bad input and prideful correction." The investor shifted in his seat. He had not spoken since apologizing. Now he looked toward Victor, then Richard. "Did your team know about that possibility?" Victor finally answered. "There are thousands of theoretical failure interactions across modern systems. We don't build procedure around every handwritten warning." Annie turned her head. It wasn't handwritten when he submitted it. Victor looked away first. That was enough. Richard saw it. So did Eleanor. So did Kyle. There are moments when guilt does not confess, but it leaves fingerprints. The captain came back on. Gear coming down. A mechanical thud ran under the cabin. The red scarf woman flinched. The gray suit man closed his eyes. Richard gripped the notebook. Annie listened to the relay, the engines, the changed load as the landing gear extended into the wind. The amber relay held. "Gear response normal," Kyle said, almost to himself. Victor checked the tablet. Confirmed. Annie did not relax. "Watch the relay during flap extension. That's when load changes again." Victor bristled, then stopped himself. He looked at the tablet. "Kyle, monitor throttle sync." Kyle did not hide the glance he gave Annie. "Already doing it," the captain said. "Flaps 1. The aircraft adjusted. A tremor passed through the floor. Annie leaned forward despite the belt, eyes fixed on the panel. 1 beat. A second. The relay clicked clean. Kyle said, "Holding." The cabin released a thin breath. "Flaps 2, the captain said a minute later. Another adjustment, another tremor. The right engine dipped, caught, and matched. Annie's shoulders eased by an inch. Eleanor noticed. That one was better. Yes, ma'am. Richard looked at Annie's hand. When we land, you're going straight to medical. I need to make sure the panel stays open through touchdown. Kyle can do that. Annie almost refused by habit. Then she looked at Kyle. He gave one small nod. Not offended. Not eager to take credit. Just ready to do the work. She said, "Okay." The word felt strange. So did letting someone else hold the line. The captain's voice lowered into the tone pilots use when asking people to trust the next few minutes. Cabin. Brace for emergency landing. We have the runway in sight. Runway in sight. The phrase moved through the cabin like sunlight under a door. The red scarf woman began to cry again. The gray suit man reached across the aisle and took her hand without asking who she was. She took his back. The investor bowed his head. Richard put Samuel Carter's notebook inside his jacket, close to his chest, then seemed to realize what he had done. He looked at Annie. "I'll return it." "I know," she said. He blinked, as if trust from her was more than he deserved. The jet descended through the last layer of wind. The runway appeared outside the windows, gray and solid, lined with emergency vehicles. Red lights flashed along the pavement. Fire trucks waited. Ambulances waited. People on the ground had prepared for wreckage, smoke, bodies, answers. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. Annie listened one last time. The engines held. The relay held. The core stayed awake. The wheels hit hard. The impact slammed everyone forward against their belts. A sharp cry came from the back. The jet bounced once, settled, then roared along the runway as reverse thrust engaged. The right engine lagged for a fraction so small most people would not have felt it. Annie felt it. Kyle saw it. Relay holding. The aircraft slowed. Not enough. Then more. The pressure against their bodies eased. The runway lights slipped past slower and slower until the jet rolled to a rough, uneven stop. For a second, nobody understood that stillness had arrived. There were no alarms screaming now, only the tick of cooling systems, the distant wail of emergency vehicles, and the ragged breathing of people who had expected to die in the water. Then the captain's voice came through, unsteady for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground." The red scarf woman sobbed openly. The gray suit man covered his face. The investor whispered, "Thank you, God," again and again. Kyle sat down hard on the floor beside the panel. Eleanor unbuckled first. Slowly, carefully, she stood. Victor said weakly, "Ma'am, remain seated until..." Eleanor looked at him. He stopped. She crossed the small space to Annie. The aircraft was still surrounded by flashing lights. The engines still winding down. The world still trying to catch up. Eleanor stood in front of the girl who had crawled beneath the floor while others told her to sit down. Then she bowed her head, not dramatically, not for show. Just a simple lowering of the chin from one human being to another. "Thank you, Annie Carter," she said. One by one, the others followed in their own way. The red scarf woman touched Annie's uninjured shoulder. The man in the gray suit whispered, "Thank you." The investor stood, then sat back down because his legs would not hold, and said it from his seat. Richard remained where he was for a moment longer. Then he stood, walked to Annie, and stopped at a distance that gave her room to refuse him if she wanted. His voice was rough. "Miss Carter." It was the first time he had said it that way. Annie looked up. Richard lowered his head. "I was wrong," he said. Outside, the emergency crew reached the door. Inside, Annie held the ice to her burned hand and listened to the engines fade into silence. The emergency crew opened the door from the outside. Cold air pushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of wet pavement, jet fuel, and Charleston salt. The stairs were rolled into place. A paramedic appeared first, then a firefighter in a yellow jacket, then a uniformed airport officer who took one look at the faces inside and stopped speaking for half a second. Nobody rushed to stand. After a near crash, even movement felt like something that needed permission. The captain stepped out of the cockpit. His shirt was damp at the collar. He looked older than he had sounded over the speaker. Behind him, the first officer kept one hand on the cockpit frame, as if he needed to feel solid metal before trusting the ground. "Everyone stay seated until medical clears the aisle," the captain said. His voice was professional again, but tired. "We're going to deplane slowly." The paramedic moved toward Annie first because Richard pointed at her before anyone asked. "She's burned," he said. Her hand. Annie shifted the towel away. The ice had melted into her sleeve. The skin across her palm had blistered in 2 places, angry red around the edges. The paramedic knelt in front of her and examined it. "What happened?" "She saved the plane," Eleanor said. The paramedic looked up, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Annie answered before the cabin could turn her into a monument. "Electrical burn. I touched a live line inside the control bay." "You crawled into the control bay during flight?" Victor Hayes made a quiet sound from near the panel. "She accessed an area she wasn't authorized to access." Richard turned toward him. "Careful." One word, low and flat. Victor closed his mouth. The paramedic wrapped Annie's hand with a sterile dressing. "We'll get you to the ambulance." "Any dizziness? Trouble breathing? Chest pain?" "No, sir." "You sure?" Annie almost said she was fine, then remembered Eleanor's warning. "My shoulder hurts. My knee, too." "That sounds more honest." The paramedic gave her a small, tired smile. "We'll check all of it." Passengers began leaving the jet in order. The red scarf woman paused beside Annie. "I'm not leaving until she does." "You'll do what medical tells you," Annie said. The woman blinked, then laughed once through tears. "You sound like my sister." "Your sister sounds smart." "She is. Annoying, too. Usually goes together," Annie said. The woman squeezed Annie's uninjured arm and moved toward the stairs. The man in the gray suit stopped next. He looked like he wanted to say something prepared, something worthy of the life he had just been given back. In the end, he only said, "My wife's going to hear your name tonight." Annie nodded. "Then tell her I'm glad you're going home." His face folded for a second. He turned away before he cried. The investor came last among the passengers. He had regained some color, but not his old certainty. "Miss Carter, I said things up there." "You did." "I was afraid." "You said that already." "I know. I'm saying it again because I don't want fear to be the only honest thing I gave you." Annie studied him. "Then do better when you're not afraid." He accepted it with a small nod. "I will try." Eleanor waited near the aisle, refusing assistance until Annie was ready. When the paramedic helped Annie stand, the whole cabin seemed to lean with her. Pain ran through her knee, but she stayed upright. Richard moved as if to help, then stopped himself. Maybe he had finally understood that help, when offered too late by powerful men, still needed permission. Annie noticed. "You can carry the notebook," she said. Richard looked down. Samuel Carter's notebook was still inside his jacket. He removed it carefully and held it with both hands. "I won't let anything happen to it." Annie believed him, though she was not ready to say why. They stepped down onto the stairs. The runway stretched gray beneath them, wet from passing mist and the heavy air near the coast. Emergency lights flashed red and white across the body of the jet. Firefighters stood near the engines. Technicians pointed at the underbelly. A small cluster of airport officials waited behind a marked line. Annie reached the ground and stopped. For the first time since the aircraft had started falling, there was nothing under her feet but pavement. Not a trembling floor, not a hidden control bay, not a machine arguing with itself. Ground. Her knees weakened. Eleanor took her elbow before the paramedic could. "Steady." Annie breathed in. The air tasted like rain and fuel. "I'm okay." "No," Eleanor said, "but you're standing." Richard came down behind them. Victor followed with Kyle and the other maintenance specialist. The moment Victor's shoes touched the runway, 2 aviation safety officers approached. One asked for his name and role. Victor answered stiffly, already rebuilding himself into a man of procedure. Kyle stood apart from him. Richard noticed. "Kyle." "Yes, sir?" "You stay with the investigators. Give them everything. Data, timestamps, what Annie said, what you saw, all of it." Victor turned sharply. "Mr. Whitmore, internal review should go through me first." Richard looked at him as if seeing him from a long distance. "No, sir, there are liability concerns. There are 12 people alive because the person you tried to silence kept working." Richard's voice did not rise, but airport staff nearby heard it. "Do not talk to me about liability before you talk to me about truth." Victor's face hardened. "I followed the chain of command. You followed your pride until it ran out of answers." The words landed in the open air. Kyle lowered his eyes, not in shame, but because he had seen the truth and did not need to stare at it. The paramedic guided Annie toward the ambulance. Richard walked beside her, still holding the notebook. For several steps he said nothing. That suited Annie. She was tired of men filling silence because they were afraid of what might grow in it. At the ambulance, the paramedic helped her sit on the edge. Another medic checked her pulse, then her pupils, then began asking routine questions. Name, date of birth, any allergies, any medications. Annie answered automatically until the medic asked. Emergency contact? My mother, Annie said. Denise Carter. You want us to call her? Annie's stomach tightened. She imagined her mother at the care facility, hair pulled back, shoes worn down from 12-hour shifts, phone buzzing in her pocket while she helped someone's father into bed. She imagined the words, aircraft emergency, ambulance, burn. Denise Carter had already buried a husband. She did not deserve a careless call. I'll call her, Annie said. Please, let me call her. The medic looked at her, then nodded. Okay. But soon, Richard stepped forward. Use my phone. Annie looked at him. He held it out without ceremony. No speech, no apology attached, just the phone. She took it with her uninjured hand and dialed from memory. Her mother answered on the fourth ring, breathless. Hello? Mama? There was a pause. A mother always heard what the world tried to hide. Annie? What's wrong? Annie closed her eyes. For the first time, her voice nearly broke. I'm on the ground. What do you mean on the ground? There was a problem with the plane. We landed in Charleston. I'm okay. Annie Carter. Do not tell me you're okay like I don't know your voice. Annie looked at her bandaged hand. I got burned a little. Denise went silent, then controlled but shaking. Who is with you? Paramedics. Mr. Whitmore. Miss Grant. Put me on speaker. Annie hesitated. Mama. Speaker. Annie obeyed. Denise Carter's voice came through clear enough for Richard to hear every word. Mr. Whitmore? Richard straightened as if he had been called before a judge. Mrs. Carter, yes. This is Richard Whitmore. My daughter left Atlanta this morning carrying papers for you. Yes, ma'am. Why is she in Charleston with a burned hand? Richard looked at Annie, then at Samuel's notebook in his own hands. The old version of him might have reached for legal language. The new fear in him, and perhaps the first edge of humility, chose differently. Because I failed to see who she was until my life depended on it, he said, and because she saved every person on my aircraft. The line went quiet. When Denise spoke again, her voice was lower. Let me talk to my daughter. Annie took the phone off speaker. Mama, you listen to me, Denise said. You let those doctors look at you. You don't argue. You don't minimize. And you keep that man near you until I know exactly where you are. Yes, ma'am. And Annie? Yes? A breath. Your daddy would be standing so tall right now. Annie bent forward over the phone, and the tears came before she could stop them. Not loud, not helpless, just the sound of a girl who had held a plane together long enough to hear her mother say she had done right. Richard turned away, giving her privacy at last. In his hands, Samuel Carter's notebook rested against his chest, heavier now than any billion-dollar contract he had carried onto the flight. Annie stayed in the ambulance with the doors open. The paramedic wanted to close them, but she asked for air, and after checking her blood pressure twice, he allowed it. Charleston's runway spread in front of her, wide and wet under the gray afternoon light. The jet sat a few hundred yards away, surrounded by emergency vehicles and men in reflective vests. From that distance, it looked almost harmless, just another expensive aircraft delayed by trouble. No one seeing it from the terminal windows would know how close it had come to becoming wreckage in the water. A medic cleaned Annie's hand again. This time the sting ran deeper. She gripped the edge of the stretcher with her good hand and stared at the ground until it passed. You need a hospital evaluation, the medic said. I know. You keep saying that like you're planning to negotiate. Annie gave him a tired look. Do I look like I have negotiating power? He glanced toward Richard Whitmore, who stood outside the ambulance speaking with 2 airport officials and a federal safety representative who had arrived fast enough to make everyone nervous. Today? Maybe. Annie followed his eyes. Richard still held her father's notebook. He was not waving it around or handing it to lawyers. He held it close, one thumb pressed against the cover. as if someone had trusted him with a living thing. Eleanor Grant stood near him, wrapped in a blanket someone had placed around her shoulders. She did not look shaken anymore. She looked watchful. Annie had seen that look in church mothers, school secretaries, retired nurses, and older women who had spent their lives knowing when a room was about to rewrite the truth if nobody guarded the door. Victor Hayes stood apart from them with his arms folded. 2 investigators were asking him questions. His answers were stiff. Every few seconds, he glanced toward Annie. Kyle was with the younger investigator near the mobile stairs, handing over the tablet data. Annie watched him point to the screen, then to the aircraft, then back to the screen. He did not look toward Victor for permission. That mattered. Richard finished with the officials and came to the ambulance. He stopped before stepping too close. "May I?" he asked. Annie noticed the question. A few hours earlier, he would have walked into any space he wanted and expected the world to move around him. She nodded. He came to the open door and handed her the notebook. "I should have returned this sooner." Annie took it carefully with her good hand. The cover was warm from where he had held it. She laid it on her lap. "Thank you," she said. Richard looked at the bandage around her hand. "They said you need to go to the hospital." "I'm going." "Good." A silence settled between them. It was not empty. It was crowded with everything he had not said on the plane and everything Annie had no strength to make easier for him. Finally, Richard spoke. "Mrs. Carter is on her way. My mother's driving down from Atlanta with my aunt. She said if anyone tries to put me on another aircraft today, she'll have them arrested." Despite himself, Richard almost smiled. "I believe her. You should." Eleanor walked over then, slow but steady. "I spoke with your mother, too." Annie looked up. "You did?" She asked whether you were being stubborn. "What did you say?" "I said yes, but in a productive way." Annie let out a breath that became half a laugh. Richard glanced toward the investigators. His face changed. "Annie, there is going to be a formal inquiry. The aircraft, the maintenance decisions, the response in the air. I want you to know my company will cooperate fully." Annie looked at him. "Will Victor?" Richard did not answer quickly. That was good. Quick answers were often designed to sound better than they were. "He'll be required to," Richard said. "That's not the same thing." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." Eleanor's eyes moved to him. "Then don't let the first report become the story. That is how people disappear from history, Mr. Whitmore. Not all at once. One passive sentence at a time." Richard looked at her. "I understand. Do you?" He held her gaze. "I'm beginning to." Annie opened the notebook on her lap. The red-tabbed page had a torn corner from Richard's hands earlier. She smoothed it with her thumb. It was a small tear, but she hated it. Then she hated herself for caring about paper when 12 people were alive. Then she stopped. Her father's work had survived too much to be treated carelessly. Richard noticed where she was looking. "I'm sorry about the page." Annie did not look up. "He wrote those notes when he was sick." Richard's face tightened. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a blanket over his shoulders. Mama would tell him to rest. He'd say, "Rest won't fix what they refuse to hear." Annie touched the handwriting. "Some nights his hands shook so badly, I had to hold the ruler for him." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. Richard said quietly, "What happened to him at the company?" Annie's mouth tightened. She had told pieces of the story before, usually to people who nodded kindly and forgot it 10 minutes later. But Richard was not asking kindly. He was asking like the answer might cost him something. "He found patterns in control failures nobody wanted to connect," she said. "He warned that automated systems could trap themselves if bad sensor data kept getting validated by backup logic. He filed reports. He asked for review panels. He was told he was overcomplicating things. By whom? Men with offices, men with signatures, men who said he didn't understand the business side of aviation." Richard looked toward the jet. "Was Whitmore involved?" Annie met his eyes. "Not your company. But people like you were always in the room somewhere." He accepted the blow without defending himself. The medic stepped closer. "We need to transport her." Richard stepped back at once. "Of course." Annie closed the notebook. "Mr. Whitmore." He stopped. "When they write the report, don't let them say, 'a passenger assisted.' Don't let them say, 'human intervention corrected the fault.' Don't let them polish it until nobody did anything, and nobody was wrong. Richard's face shifted with something like shame. What should it say? He asked. The truth. Eleanor nodded. Start there. It'll be harder than it sounds. The medic helped Annie shift back onto the stretcher. As he secured the strap across her waist, Kyle hurried over from the aircraft. Annie, he said, slightly out of breath. She turned. He held up the tablet. Not too high, not like a trophy. I gave them the data sequence. Your timestamps match the recovery. The gray cable, the relay, the throttle sync. It's all there. Victor stood 20 yards away, watching. Annie said, Thank you. Kyle shook his head. No. Thank you. I almost stayed quiet. That would have been easier. Yeah, he said. That's what bothers me. Before Annie could answer, Victor approached. The investigators did not stop him, but one followed close enough to hear. Victor looked at Annie's bandaged hand, then at the notebook, then at Richard. I'd like a word with Miss Carter. Richard's body stiffened. Eleanor took one step nearer the ambulance. Annie said, Say it here. Victor's jaw tightened. He did not like witnesses. That was clear now. I made decisions based on aircraft safety, he said. If my tone was harsh, it was because the situation required urgency. Annie watched him. That's your apology? Victor looked away. I'm acknowledging the conditions were difficult. Eleanor gave a dry sound. That is not an apology. That is weather with a necktie. Kyle lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Richard did not smile. Victor, step away. Sir, I need to protect the record. Richard's voice hardened. That is exactly why you need to step away. Victor looked at the investigator, then back at Richard. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the room, or in this case the runway, no longer belonged to him. He stepped back. The ambulance doors began to close. Richard moved beside the opening before they shut. Annie. She looked at him. I won't let them erase this. Annie held Samuel Carter's notebook against her chest. Don't promise it because you're grateful, she said. Promise it because it's right. Richard stood on the wet pavement, emergency lights flashing across his suit, and nodded once. Because it's right, he said. The doors closed, and the ambulance started toward the hospital. Through the small rear window, Annie saw the jet grow smaller behind her. She saw Richard, Eleanor, Kyle, Victor, the investigators, the flashing lights, the runway, all of it shrinking into the distance. For the first time since she had unbuckled her seatbelt, Annie let herself lean back. Her hand hurt. Her body hurt. But the engines had gone quiet, and the truth had not. The hospital in Charleston smelled like antiseptic, coffee, and raincoats drying near the entrance. Annie sat on an examination bed with her feet hanging above the floor. Samuel Carter's notebook resting beside her hip. A nurse had replaced the runway bandage with a cleaner one and wrapped her hand in white gauze from the base of her fingers to her wrist. The burn was not life-threatening, the doctor had said, but it would hurt for a while. Her shoulder was bruised. Her knee was swollen. Nothing broken. Nothing broken. Annie kept returning to that phrase as if it belonged to more than her body. Her phone buzzed for the 6th time in 10 minutes. Her mother had already called twice from the road, then texted when the signal dropped, then called again through Annie's aunt's phone because Denise Carter trusted no network and no billionaire with her daughter's safety. Annie answered before the second ring. Mama, I'm still in the same room. I'm checking. I know. Did they give you something for pain? Yes, ma'am. Did you take it? Annie looked at the paper cup on the tray beside her. Not yet. Annie, it makes me sleepy. You survived a falling airplane. You are allowed to be sleepy. Annie almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. A pause came through the line, filled with road noise and her aunt saying something in the background. Denise's voice softened. I'm about an hour out. Don't leave that hospital. I won't. And keep Mr. Whitmore away from signing anything over your head before I get there. Annie glanced toward the closed curtain around her bed. He's not here. Good. But Richard was there. Not inside the curtain, not crowding the doctor, not making demands. He was somewhere down the hall in a waiting area, because a nurse had told Annie that a man in an expensive suit kept asking if she needed anything, and then apologizing for asking too often. Denise lowered her voice. Baby, are you really all right? Annie looked at the notebook. The corner Richard had torn was still visible, small and pale against the red-tabbed page. "I don't know yet," she said. That was the first fully honest answer she had given since the jet touched the runway. Denise went quiet. Then she said, "That's all right. Just keep breathing until I get there." "I can do that." "I know you can. You've been doing hard things since before you had the words for them." The call ended a minute later. After 3 more instructions and 1 prayer Denise did not ask permission to say. Annie set the phone down and leaned back against the pillow. The curtain opened a few inches. Eleanor Grant stood there with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and her blanket still around her shoulders. "May I come in?" "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor stepped inside and studied Annie the way older Southern women did, not rudely, but thoroughly. Shoes, face, bandage, posture, eyes. "You look tired." "I am." "Good. Means your body has sense." Annie looked at the coffee. "They let you have that?" "At my age, child, people let me have many things because they don't want the conversation that follows if they say no." This time Annie did smile. Eleanor sat in the visitor chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt different from the quiet on the plane. It had walls around it, fluorescent lights, a cart squeaking somewhere in the hall, a television playing low in another room. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Eleanor rested the cup on her knee. "Mr. Whitmore is outside." "I figured. He wants to talk to you." Annie looked away. "A lot of people want to talk after they realize they were wrong." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and not all of them deserve to." Annie turned back to her. Eleanor continued, "But some need to, because if they don't say it plainly, they'll turn it into a lesson they learned instead of harm they caused." The words settled. Annie had heard apologies that were really speeches. She had heard people say, "I'm sorry you felt that way," which meant they were sorry feelings made consequences inconvenient. She had watched adults forgive each other in public and forget the person who had been wounded in private. "What if I don't want to make him feel better?" Annie asked. "Then don't." "That simple?" "No. But it is that clear." Annie touched the edge of the notebook with her good hand. "My father used to say justice arriving late still brings grief with it." Eleanor nodded. "Your father understood America." The curtain opened again, this time only after a knock. Richard Whitmore stood outside. His tie was gone. His white shirt was wrinkled. The man who had boarded the jet that morning had looked polished enough for cameras. The man standing at the curtain looked like he had finally met something his money could not command. "May I come in?" he asked. Annie glanced at Eleanor. Eleanor did not decide for her. "Yes," Annie said. Richard entered and remained standing until Annie nodded toward the second chair. He sat carefully, as if sudden movement might be disrespectful. "I spoke with the investigators," he said. "Kyle gave them the data. The cockpit recordings confirm your instructions. The diagnostic logs show the cable spike and relay recovery exactly as you described." Annie waited. Facts were not the same as accountability. Richard seemed to know it. He folded his hands, then unfolded them. "Victor has been suspended pending review." Eleanor sipped her coffee. "Pending review can mean many things." "It will mean what it should mean," Richard said, then looked at Annie. "I'm bringing in an independent aviation safety firm. Not one on our payroll, not friends of Victor, not anyone who owes me comfort." Annie studied him. "Why?" "Because you told me not to let them polish the truth until nobody was wrong." He had remembered her words exactly. That mattered. Not enough to erase anything, but enough to keep listening. Richard drew a breath. "And because I was part of what went wrong," Annie's fingers stilled on the notebook. He continued before she could ask. "I didn't touch the system. I didn't ignore the data. But I built a world around me where someone like Victor could speak with certainty, and someone like you could be treated as noise. I did that. My company did that. I rewarded confidence before humility, credentials before listening." His voice tightened. "And when you stood up, I told you to sit down." The room went quiet except for the hum of the hospital vent. Annie looked at him. "You did. I called you in the way." "Yes, sir." Richard flinched slightly at the polite answer, maybe because it carried no forgiveness inside it. "I'm sorry," he said. Annie had imagined, if anyone ever said that after underestimating her, that she might feel victorious. She did not. She felt tired. She felt 18 and older than 18. She felt the burn under the gauze and the weight of her father's notebook beside her. "Thank you for saying it plainly." she said. Richard nodded. It was more than he deserved and less than he wanted. He seemed to understand both. There is something else, he said. Your father, Samuel Carter. Annie's body went still. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Not a contract. A printout. One of the investigators ran the technical language from the notebook against older aviation safety submissions. Your father's name appears in archived correspondence tied to a control logic review 12 years ago. Annie stopped breathing for a moment. What? They found his name, Richard said. Not where it should have been, not on the final report, but in the correspondence. He warned about loop behavior under conflicting sensor validation. The wording is different, but it is there. Annie reached for the paper. Richard handed it to her. Her good hand shook as she unfolded it. There, halfway down the page, in plain black type, was the name she had grown up defending in rooms that did not care. Samuel D. Carter. For a moment, the hospital vanished. Annie was back at the kitchen table, watching her father write through pain. Back in the garage, hearing him tell her that machines told the truth. Back beside his bed, listening to him apologize for leaving her with notebooks instead of money. She covered her mouth. Eleanor set down her coffee. Richard spoke quietly. Annie, I don't know yet who buried his work. I don't know how deep it goes. But I have the resources to find out. And for once, I intend to use them for something better than winning. Annie wiped her eyes with the side of her wrist, careful not to touch the bandage. My father died thinking nobody heard him, she said. Richard looked at the floor. Today, everyone on that aircraft did. That's not enough. No, he said, it isn't. The curtain rustled hard, and Denise Carter stepped into the room with her purse still over her shoulder and rain on her sleeves. Her eyes went first to Annie's face, then the bandaged hand, then Richard. Which one of you is Whitmore? She asked. Richard stood immediately. I am. Denise looked him up and down with the exhausted fury of a mother who had driven across state lines imagining every possible grief. Then she said, You and I are going to talk after I hug my daughter. Richard stepped back. Yes, ma'am. Denise crossed the room and wrapped Annie carefully in both arms. Annie leaned into her mother and finally let her body understand that the flight was over. Denise held her close, one hand on the back of Annie's head. My baby, she whispered. My brave, hard-headed baby. Annie closed her eyes. Over her mother's shoulder, she saw Richard standing beside Eleanor, holding himself still, waiting his turn in a room where he no longer had the highest authority. For the first time all day, Annie felt the order of the world shift in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. Denise Carter did not let go quickly. Annie did not mind. Her mother smelled like rain, hand sanitizer, and the peppermint gum she chewed on long drives to stay awake. For most of the day, Annie had been answering questions from frightened passengers, pilots, maintenance men, paramedics, investigators, and a billionaire, learning how little his certainty was worth. In her mother's arms, nobody needed an explanation. Denise held her like she had held her after fevers, school disappointments, and the night Samuel's breathing changed for the last time. When Denise finally pulled back, she took Annie's face in both hands and looked at her the way only a mother could. You scared 10 years off my life. I didn't mean to. You never do. That has not stopped you yet. Annie gave a weak smile. Denise's eyes moved to the bandage. The smile disappeared from both of them. Does it hurt? Yes, ma'am. Good. At least we're telling the truth in here. Eleanor stood from her chair. Mrs. Carter, I'm Eleanor Grant. Denise turned, and something in her shoulders softened at the sight of the older woman. You were with her? I was on the plane. Your daughter kept her head when the rest of us misplaced ours. Denise shook Eleanor's hand with both of hers. Thank you for looking after her. Eleanor glanced at Annie. She did most of the looking after. Richard remained standing near the curtain, silent. Denise turned to him last. The room tightened around the movement. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Mrs. Carter, you put my daughter on that plane to carry papers. Yes, ma'am. She came home with burns. Yes, ma'am. And somewhere between those two things you learned her name. Richard did not look away. Too late. Denise studied him. She was not impressed by humility, because she had seen men use it as a coat they wore until the weather changed. Too late is honest. It is not an excuse. No, Mom. Annie watched him take that without defense. She had seen grown men become children under her mother's stare. Richard Whitmore did not become a child. Exactly. He became a man without the tools he usually used. Denise set her purse on the chair and sat beside Annie's bed. Tell me what happens now. Richard drew a careful breath. An independent investigation. Full cooperation. Victor Hayes has been suspended. The flight data, cockpit audio, maintenance logs, cabin recordings, everything will be preserved. Denise lifted one eyebrow. Preserved by whom? By the safety authorities and independent counsel. And your lawyers? They will be involved. Of course they will. Richard accepted the cut. But they will not shape the technical findings. I've already instructed them. Denise looked at Eleanor. Do you believe that? Eleanor took her time. I believe he knows this room will not let him do otherwise. That's something, Denise said. Annie lowered her eyes to the paper with Samuel's name. It lay beside the notebook now. A thin, official proof of something her family had known for years. Samuel D. Carter. Black letters on white paper. So small for a whole life. Denise noticed it. What is that? Annie picked it up with her good hand and passed it to her mother. They found Daddy's name in old correspondence. About the same kind of failure. Denise went still. Richard spoke quietly. It appears Mr. Carter warned about loop behavior years ago. Denise read the page once, then again. Her mouth pressed tight, but she did not cry. Not yet. Annie knew that look. Denise Carter did not give tears to strangers until she decided whether they deserved to see them. He told me, Denise said. Annie turned to her. Denise kept her eyes on the paper. Near the end, he said, Denise, one day that loop is going to hurt somebody because they were too proud to listen. I told him to rest. I was tired. He was tired. Bills were on the table. Medicine bottles everywhere. She swallowed. I told him the world had already taken enough from him. Eleanor's face softened. Denise touched Samuel's printed name. He said, Then I better leave Annie, the part it didn't take. Annie closed her eyes. She had known her father loved her. She had known the notebooks mattered. But hearing that he had chosen them for her, not as leftovers but as inheritance, broke something open. Richard's voice was low. Mrs. Carter, I am sorry. Denise looked up. For what? He did not rush. For being the kind of man who would have ignored him. The room went quiet. That was the first apology that reached Denise. Annie saw it in the small change around her mother's eyes. Denise folded the paper once, carefully, and handed it back to Annie. Then, don't honor him with pity. He would hate that. What would he want? Richard asked. For people like him not to have to die before someone reads the page. Eleanor murmured, Amen. A knock came at the curtain. Kyle stood outside with a hospital visitor badge clipped crookedly to his shirt. He looked unsure whether he belonged there. Sorry, they told me I could come back for a minute. Annie shifted on the bed. Come in. Kyle entered, nodded to Denise and Eleanor, then looked at Richard. The investigators confirmed the damaged cable. Chafing against the clamp, just like Annie said. They're photographing it now, Richard asked. And Victor? Kyle's jaw worked. He told them the cabin environment made it difficult to evaluate all suggestions. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. That is a polished sentence. It gets worse, Kyle said. He's saying Annie acted before he could complete his own assessment. Denise stood so fast the chair legs scraped the floor. He is saying what? Annie felt heat rise through her chest. Not fear this time. Anger. Richard's face went cold. Did he put that in writing? Not yet. But he said it to the investigator. Eleanor set her coffee down. There it is. Richard turned to her. The second crash, she said. Not into the ocean, into the record. Annie looked down at her bandaged hand. Victor had not stopped when the plane landed. He had only changed tools. In the air, he had used authority. On the ground, he would use language. Richard pulled out his phone. I'll handle it. Denise snapped. No. He stopped. She stepped toward him. You will not handle my daughter like a problem that landed on your desk. You will not go into a room alone and come back telling us it is settled. If he is trying to rewrite what happened, then Annie speaks for Annie. Annie looked at her mother. Mama, Denise turned. You want to speak? Annie looked at Kyle, then Eleanor, then Richard. Her hand hurt. Her body wanted sleep. Some part of her wanted to go home, eat soup from her mother's kitchen, and never see another executive jet again. But Samuel Carter's name lay on her lap. She nodded. Yes. Richard put his phone away. Then I'll arrange for the investigator to take her statement here, Eleanor said. And I will give mine. Kyle added. Me too. Denise looked at him. You were on the maintenance team? Yes, ma'am. You spoke up? Kyle's face colored. Eventually, Denise held his gaze long enough to make him feel the weight of that word. Then she said, eventually is better than never. Don't waste it. Kyle nodded. I won't. Within 20 minutes, the hospital room changed. Not physically, not much. Same bed, same curtain, same rolling tray, and cup of water. But the air shifted. A safety investigator named Marcia Bell arrived with a recorder, a laptop, and the tired focus of a woman who had heard too many people try to make negligence sound like weather. She asked Annie if she was willing to give a statement. Annie looked at her mother. Denise stood beside the bed, arms folded. Yes, Annie said, but I want my mother here. Of course. And Miss Grant. Eleanor nodded once. Marcia set the recorder on the tray. Start wherever you need to. Annie rested her good hand on the notebook. She did not start with the burn or the cable. She started with the first sound under the floor, the repeating rhythm, the false signal. She described Victor ordering repeated resets, the system worsening, her warning, his refusal, Richard telling her to sit down, the passengers objecting, the captain asking for a decision. She did not embellish. She did not soften. When she reached the part where Victor shoved her back from the panel and told her she could kill everyone by touching the pressure system, Marcia looked up. Did he provide a technical basis for that warning? Annie shook her head. No. He used it to scare them. Kyle, standing near the wall, said quietly, That's how it sounded to me too. Marcia made a note. Annie continued until the story reached the gray cable, the relay, the throttle sync, and the climb. Her voice stayed steady except once, when she mentioned her father's notebook. Denise placed a hand on her shoulder then, and Annie kept going. When she finished, Marcia turned off the recorder. Miss Carter, she said. That was clear. Annie was too tired to answer. Richard stood near the curtain, silent through the whole statement. When Marcia left, he remained where he was. Denise looked at him. Now you may handle your employee. Richard nodded. Not to protect the company. To protect the truth. Eleanor picked up her coffee. That sentence better survive the hallway. It will, Richard said. He left the room with Kyle behind him. Annie leaned back. The pain medicine, finally taken under Denise's watch, had begun to soften the edges of the room. Her mother sat beside her and took her good hand. You did right, Denise said. Annie looked at the folded paper with Samuel's name tucked into the notebook. So did Daddy, she whispered. Denise nodded, and this time she let one tear fall. Yes, she said. He did. Richard found Victor Hayes in a conference room 2 floors below the hospital lobby. The airport authority had given investigators the room because it had a long table, working outlets, and no windows for reporters to peer through. A pot of coffee sat in the corner, already burned bitter. Paper cups were stacked beside it. Someone had opened a sleeve of crackers and forgotten them. It looked less like a place where powerful men made decisions and more like a church basement after a long committee meeting. Victor stood at the far end of the table with his headset in one hand and his phone in the other. When Richard entered, Victor straightened as if posture could restore the day. Kyle came in behind Richard and closed the door. Victor looked at him first. This is an internal conversation. Richard did not sit. No, it isn't. Victor's eyes moved back to him. Sir, I understand emotions are high. Don't. The word landed hard. Victor lowered his phone. I'm trying to protect you. Richard almost laughed, but the sound died before it reached his mouth. That's what you're calling it? What would you call it? Protecting yourself with company stationery. Victor's face tightened. I made the safest judgment possible with the information I had. Kyle said. That's not true. Victor turned sharply. You need to be very careful. Kyle's voice shook once, then steadied. I was careful in the air. I watched Data confirm what Annie said while you kept dismissing her. I watched you interrupt her, scare the passengers, and try to stop her after the system started responding. Victor looked at Richard. He is junior staff. Richard said. So was Annie. Victor had no answer for that. The door opened, and Marcia Bell entered with a folder under her arm. She glanced from Richard to Victor to Kyle. Good. Everyone I needed is already here. Victor's jaw moved. Miss Bell, I was about to submit a preliminary clarification. I'm sure you were. She set the folder on the table, took out a printed transcript, and placed it in front of him. Victor looked down. Marcia tapped the page. Cabin audio, your statement at 1:42 p.m. You said, quote, she has no clearance and no training on this aircraft. At 1:44, you stated that Miss Carter could blow the pressure system with one wrong touch. We're requesting the technical basis for that claim. Victor looked at Richard. Richard did not help him. It was a risk assessment, Victor said. Based on what component? The adjacent pressure control routing. Kyle frowned. That routing doesn't run through the panel she touched. Marcia looked at Kyle. You're certain? Yes, ma'am. I checked the aircraft diagram after landing. The pressure warning was not relevant to the gray cable or the throttle relay. Victor snapped. It was a live emergency. Nobody had the luxury of perfect phrasing. Marcia's pen paused. Mr. Hayes, inaccurate technical warnings in an emergency can influence decision-making. That is not a phrasing problem. Richard watched Victor's face. He had seen that look across negotiating tables for 25 years. It was the look of a man calculating which admission cost less. Victor chose anger. So this is what we're doing, he said. A girl crawls into a panel, gets lucky, and now everyone wants to pretend she was leading a recovery operation? Kyle stared at him. She was. Victor laughed once. She had an old notebook. She had the right diagnosis, Kyle said. She had no authority. Richard stepped closer to the table. Authority did not save us. Victor turned to him. Sir, with respect, you are alive because your aircraft was engineered with redundancy, because trained professionals kept systems online long enough for an intervention, and because the pilots maintained control, not because of some fairy tale about listening to machines. Richard's voice stayed low. I am alive because Annie Carter found the false signal after your team said there were no options. Victor pointed at Kyle. And now he's building a career out of saying yes to her. Kyle's face flushed, but he did not back down. No. I'm trying to build one where I don't have to lie to keep my job. Marcia wrote something down. Victor noticed and went quiet. Richard finally sat, not at the head of the table. In the middle, across from Victor. The choice was deliberate, and Victor saw it. I trusted you, Richard said. Not just today, for years. I trusted the way you spoke. I trusted the absence of doubt in your voice. I mistook that for competence. Victor's expression shifted, stung now. My record speaks for itself. Today it does. Silence filled the room. Richard continued. You are suspended pending the investigation, effective immediately. You will not contact Annie Carter, Denise Carter, Eleanor Grant, Kyle, the pilots, or any passenger without counsel and investigator approval. You will surrender all flight data copies and company devices related to the aircraft. Victor's face went pale with anger. You're making me the villain to protect yourself. No, Richard said. I'm making the record harder to bury. Marcia closed her folder. Mr. Whitmore, we'll need written confirmation of those instructions. You'll have it within the hour. Victor picked up his phone. My attorney will respond. That is your right, Marcia said. Victor looked at Kyle on his way out. You'll regret this. Kyle's mouth tightened. Maybe. But not as much as I'd regret staying quiet. Victor left. For a moment, the room held the shape of him. Then the door clicked shut, and the air changed. Kyle sat down as if his legs had only now received permission to weaken. I thought I was going to throw up. Richard looked at him. You still might. Kyle gave a short laugh, then rubbed his face. I should have spoken sooner. Yes, Richard said. Kyle looked up, startled by the bluntness. Richard did not soften it. And I should have listened sooner. We don't help anyone by pretending. Late courage is the same as early courage. Kyle nodded slowly. No, sir. Marcia gathered her papers. Late courage is still useful if it keeps telling the truth. Richard looked toward the door. Then let's make sure it does. By the time Richard returned upstairs, The hallway outside Annie's room had grown crowded in the quiet way hospitals become crowded when people are waiting for news that has already changed them. Denise stood near the nurse's station, speaking into her phone. Her voice was low, but Richard caught enough to know she was talking to someone from home. "She's banged up, but she's here," Denise said. "Yes, I told her. No, she has not eaten. I'm working on that." Eleanor sat in a chair beside the room, still wrapped in the blanket, now holding a second cup of coffee. She looked at Richard as he approached. "Well?" she asked. "Victor is suspended, devices secured, contact restricted, written confirmation going to the investigator." Eleanor studied him. "That is a start." "I know. Do you?" Richard almost answered too quickly, then stopped. "I'm learning the difference between fixing a problem and repairing harm." Eleanor nodded. "Good. One buys silence, the other takes time." Denise ended her call and turned to him. "Did he admit what he did?" "No." "Did you expect him to?" Richard looked down the hallway. "Part of me did. That was foolish." Denise crossed her arms. People who are practiced at erasing others are usually practiced at sounding reasonable while they do it. Richard absorbed that. "Mrs. Carter, may I speak with Annie?" Denise's answer came immediately. "She's resting." "Of course." He stepped back. Denise watched him for a second. "That was not a test. She is actually resting." Eleanor laughed softly into her coffee. Richard allowed himself a tired smile. "Understood." Inside the room, Annie was not asleep. The pain medicine had made the edges of everything softer, but her mind kept returning to the aircraft, the cable, the relay, Victor's voice, Richard's face, her mother's arms. She heard the adults outside through the curtain, not every word, just tones. Her mother's firmness, Eleanor's dry calm, Richard's careful restraint. She turned the folded paper over in her hand again. Samuel D. Carter. A nurse had brought tape and helped her place the printout inside the notebook so it would not be lost. It rested now opposite one of Samuel's old diagrams, official record facing handwritten warning. Annie thought her father would have had something quiet and cutting to say about that. Maybe took them long enough to read the footnotes. The curtain opened a little, and Denise stepped in. "You awake?" "Yes, ma'am." "Of course you are." Denise carried a paper bowl of soup from the cafeteria and a packet of crackers. "Eat. I'm not hungry. I did not ask for a weather report from your stomach." Annie took the bowl. The soup was too salty and not hot enough. It was also the best thing she had tasted all day because her mother sat beside her and crushed the crackers into it the way she had when Annie was small and sick. After a few bites, Annie said, "Is Mr. Whitmore still out there?" "Yes." "What's he doing?" "Waiting." Annie stirred the soup. "For what?" Denise looked at her daughter. "Permission, I think." Annie was quiet. Denise leaned back. "You don't have to give it tonight." "I know. Do you?" Annie looked at the notebook. "He said Daddy's name." Denise's face changed. Annie continued, "Not like he was doing me a favor. He said it like it mattered." Denise took a slow breath. "That can matter and still not be enough." "I know." "Good." Annie ate another spoonful. Outside, footsteps passed, carts rolled, phones rang, and somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the jet sat on the ground with its open panel and wounded wires waiting for investigators. The world was already trying to turn the emergency into reports, statements, liability, and news. Annie placed her good hand over the notebook. Let them write, she thought. This time, the Carters had witnesses. By morning, the story had already reached the news. Not the whole truth. Not yet. The first reports were thin and cautious, stitched together from airport statements and nervous witnesses at the terminal. A private aircraft owned by Whitmore Global had made an emergency landing in Charleston after a mid-air systems failure. 12 passengers and crew were safe. One unnamed passenger had sustained minor injuries while assisting on board. Annie read that line twice on her mother's phone. One unnamed passenger. Denise saw her face and took the phone back before Annie could hand it over. "Minor injuries," she said, looking at Annie's wrapped hand. "Unnamed passenger. Assisting on board. That is how they start." Eleanor Grant stood near the window, already dressed in the same clothes from the day before, because the airline had not yet returned anyone's luggage. Soft words are useful when someone wants the truth to go to sleep. Annie sat on the edge of the hospital bed, discharged but not yet released from her mother's inspection. Her hand had been wrapped again. her shoulder taped, her knee fitted with a soft brace. The doctor said she could travel by car if she rested. Denise said the doctor was optimistic in the way doctors became when they were not driving the patient home themselves. Richard arrived just after 9. He knocked on the open door and waited. Denise looked at him. "Come in." He entered with a folder in one hand and Samuel Carter's notebook in the other. Annie noticed that he carried the notebook separately from the folder, not tucked under it, not pressed against legal documents. That small respect did not fix anything, but she saw it. "I saw the article," Richard said. Denise folded her arms. "Which part did you enjoy?" "Unnamed or minor?" Richard accepted it. "Neither. That statement did not come from my office, but it came from somewhere that knew how to make her disappear." "Yes," he said, "and that ends today." Annie looked up. "How?" Richard opened the folder and removed a typed statement. "Press conference at noon. Charleston Airport Media Room. I will state what happened clearly. Your name, your father's name, Victor's suspension, the independent investigation. No vague language." Denise took the paper before Annie could. She read it slowly, her lips pressed together. Eleanor moved closer. "Read the third paragraph out loud." Denise did. "Yesterday afternoon, Annie Carter, an intern with Whitmore Global Infrastructure, identified a core system loop failure that my aviation maintenance team failed to resolve. Miss Carter used technical knowledge inherited from her late father, Samuel D. Carter, whose prior warnings regarding looped control behavior appear to have been ignored in earlier industry correspondence. Her actions directly contributed to the safe recovery and landing of the aircraft." Denise lowered the page. For a moment, nobody spoke. Annie felt the words in a place deeper than pride. Directly contributed was still careful, still legal, but it was not erased. Annie Carter, Samuel D. Carter, failed to resolve, ignored. The bones of the truth were there. Eleanor looked at Richard. "Why directly contributed?" Richard met her eyes. "Because the captain flew the aircraft, Kyle secured the bay, and the emergency crew completed the response. Annie saved us." I will say that sentence aloud, but the written statement has to survive lawyers, regulators, and people who will attack any overreach to discredit the whole thing. Denise read his face, then the page again. "That is unfortunately true." Annie looked at Richard. "You'll say it out loud?" "Yes." "Not assisted?" "No." "Not helped the crew?" "No." Richard's voice grew quieter. "I will say you saved our lives." Annie nodded once. "Then say my father warned them too." "I will." A hospital administrator came by with discharge papers, and for 10 minutes the room turned ordinary. "Sign here, initial there, follow-up appointment. Keep the burn clean. Watch for fever. Do not drive on pain medication." Denise asked questions like a woman cross-examining a witness. Eleanor asked whether the hospital had decent coffee. Annie signed with her left hand and made a mess of her own name. By late morning, Richard had arranged a private car to take them to the airport media room. Denise almost refused on principle, then accepted because Annie's knee hurt and principle did not need to make the child limp through a parking lot. The car ride was quiet. Charleston passed outside in damp streets, live oaks, old brick, church steeples, people walking dogs as if the world had not nearly ended for a plane full of strangers the day before. Annie watched from the back seat with the notebook on her lap. Denise sat beside her. "You don't have to speak. I know. If they ask questions you don't like, you look at me." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor sat in the front passenger seat. "And if your mother runs out of glare, I have some left." Annie smiled despite herself. The airport media room was smaller than Annie expected. A podium stood before a blue backdrop with the airport seal. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters murmured over phones and notepads. Richard's staff moved nervously near the side doors. Kyle stood near the front with the captain and first officer. Victor was not there. Richard paused before stepping into the room. He turned to Annie. "I won't ask you to forgive me in front of cameras." "Good," Annie said. His mouth tightened, almost a smile, almost pain. "Good." He walked to the podium. Flashbulbs clicked. Questions started at once, but Richard lifted one hand. "I'll make a statement first." His voice carried the old authority, but not the old arrogance. Annie could hear the difference. Maybe nobody else could, but she could. Yesterday, my aircraft suffered a serious in-flight systems failure over the Atlantic. 12 passengers, 2 pilots, and onboard personnel could have died. We did not. The reason we are standing here today is not because of my wealth, my schedule, or my position. We are here because Annie Carter heard what others dismissed and acted when trained personnel had run out of answers. The room changed. Cameras shifted toward Annie. Denise moved half a step closer to her daughter. Richard continued, "Miss Carter is an intern at my company. Yesterday, I treated that title as a limit on what she could know. That was my failure. My head of maintenance did the same, with greater consequence. He has been suspended pending investigation." A reporter called out, "Are you saying an intern repaired the aircraft?" Richard looked directly at him. "I am saying Annie Carter identified the core system loop failure, isolated the false signal, guided the recovery sequence, and prevented the loss of the aircraft." The reporter stopped writing for a second. Richard placed both hands on the podium. "I am also saying her knowledge came from her late father, Samuel D. Carter, an aviation systems engineer whose archived correspondence shows he warned about looped control behavior years earlier. We are investigating why those warnings were not properly elevated or credited." Annie's grip tightened on the notebook. Denise whispered, "There it is." Richard turned from the cameras and looked at Annie. "Miss Carter, I owe you my life. But more than that, I owe you the truth in public, because I denied it in private first." The room went quiet enough for camera shutters to sound loud. Annie had not planned to speak. She had promised her mother she did not have to. But Richard stepped back from the podium and did not gesture her forward. He left the choice open. That made it hers. Annie moved before fear could make a committee in her head. Denise walked with her to the first row, then stopped. Annie continued to the podium alone, notebook held against her side. The microphones looked like a cluster of black flowers. She adjusted one with her good hand. "My father used to say machines don't panic," Annie said. "People do. Yesterday, a lot of people panicked. Some of them had good reason. Some of them had titles. Some of them had authority. But panic wasn't what almost killed us." No one interrupted. "What almost killed us was a false signal everybody kept trusting because the system treated it like truth." She looked toward Richard, then Kyle, then the reporters. "That happens outside machines too. A false idea gets repeated long enough, and people start building decisions around it. That a girl like me couldn't know. That a man like my father couldn't be right unless someone more powerful agreed. That an intern should sit down even when she hears the warning." Her voice shook once. She let it shake and kept going. "My father died thinking maybe nobody had listened. Yesterday, his work helped bring 12 people home. So if you write anything, write his name right. Samuel D. Carter. And write mine too. Annie Carter, not unnamed passenger." Denise covered her mouth. Eleanor closed her eyes. Richard looked down. Annie stepped away from the podium before questions could turn her pain into entertainment. Reporters shouted anyway. "Miss Carter, will you sue? Are you joining the investigation? Did racism play a role? Mr. Whitmore, what compensation will she receive? Was the aircraft unsafe before takeoff?" Richard moved back to the podium. "Miss Carter will not be answering further questions today. Direct them to me." This time, Annie did not mind him using his authority. He used it as a shield, not a leash. After the conference, in a side room away from cameras, Richard handed Denise and Annie a copy of the full statement, the investigation notice, and written confirmation that Victor had been suspended. Denise read every page. Eleanor sat beside Annie and patted her knee. "You did fine." "I almost threw up." "That would have been understandable too." Richard waited until Denise finished. "There is something else I want to discuss, but not here and not today if Annie is too tired." Denise looked at Annie. Annie was tired. Her hand ached. Her knee throbbed. Her father's name was on every reporter's recording device, and that felt both healing and unbearable. "What is it?" she asked. Richard folded his hands. "Your education, your future, and a way to make sure Samuel Carter's name opens doors instead of sitting in an archive." Denise narrowed her eyes. "That sounds expensive." "It should be," Richard said. Eleanor's mouth curved. "For once, Mr. Whitmore. That may be the right answer." Annie looked down at the notebook. The worn cover rested under her bandaged hand. A day earlier, It had been a private inheritance. Now, it had become evidence, witness, and doorway, all at once. She looked back at Richard. "Then we'll talk," she said. "But my mother stays in the room." Richard nodded. "I was counting on it." They met in a small conference room behind the media area, away from cameras and airport noise. It had a round table, 6 chairs, a coffee machine that had already given up on dignity, and a window facing a service road where baggage carts moved in slow lines. Annie sat between her mother and Eleanor Grant, Samuel Carter's notebook on the table in front of her. Richard sat across from them, not at the head because there was no head to take. That was the first thing Denise noticed. She did not praise him for it. Richard placed a folder on the table but did not open it. "Before I say anything, I want to be clear. This is not payment for silence." Denise leaned back. "Good opening. Keep going." Annie looked at her mother, but Richard almost smiled. "It is not a settlement offer. It is not tied to any waiver. It does not prevent Annie from speaking to investigators, reporters, attorneys, or anyone else. It does not ask her to protect me, my company, or my reputation." Eleanor lifted her coffee. "Now you sound like a man who has been properly frightened by a mother." "I have," Richard said. Denise gave him nothing. He opened the folder and slid one page across the table. "I want to fund Annie's education. Full tuition, housing, books, travel, medical expenses related to yesterday, and living support. Any accredited aerospace engineering program she chooses. No condition that she return to Whitmore Global. No requirement that she work for me." Annie looked at the page without touching it. For most of her life, college had lived in the Carter home like a beautiful thing behind glass. They talked about scholarships, community college, federal aid, part-time work, loans, maybe Georgia Tech if miracles learned to fill out forms. Her mother never said impossible. Samuel had never said impossible either. But Annie had seen the stack of bills. She knew the distance between talent and tuition. Denise read the page twice. "This says living support." "Yes." "How much?" Richard named a number. Denise stared at him. "Per year?" "Per year. That is more than I make." "I know." "No, Mr. Whitmore. You know the number. You do not know what it means." Richard took that in. "You're right." Annie touched the edge of the paper. Her bandaged hand moved awkwardly. "Why?" Richard looked at her. "Because you should not have to carry your father's notebook under the floor of a failing aircraft before someone invests in your mind." The room went quiet. Annie wanted to reject it because pride rose fast when generosity came from a man who had dismissed her. Then she thought of her father coughing at the kitchen table, still drawing diagrams. She thought of her mother's shoes by the door after double shifts. She thought of every bright student who had been told to dream smaller because dreaming cost money. "What about my father?" she asked. Richard nodded, as if he had been waiting for the right question. He slid over a second document. The Samuel Carter Aviation Scholarship Fund. Annie did touch that one. The title was printed across the top in plain black letters. "The fund starts with 12 annual scholarships," Richard said. "Aviation maintenance, aerospace engineering, avionics, flight systems, safety analysis. Priority for students from underrepresented communities, especially those without industry access. It will cover tuition support, mentorship, internships, and travel to training sites." Denise's eyes stayed on the page. "Why 12? Richard looked at Annie. "For the 12 people who walked off that aircraft." Eleanor set her cup down carefully. "And who chooses the students?" "Not me alone," Richard said. "A board. Mrs. Carter, if you're willing, I would ask you to serve. Miss Grant as well. Annie, when you're ready, there will be a seat for you." Denise's expression changed, but she kept her voice steady. "You want me on a scholarship board?" "Yes, ma'am. I am not an aviation expert." "No, but you know the difference between opportunity and charity. I suspect this fund will need that more than another man with a plaque." Eleanor gave a soft hum. That one was almost wise. Richard looked at her. "Almost is progress." Annie read the words again. Samuel Carter Aviation Scholarship Fund. Her father's name did not look buried there. It looked placed. Still, she did not say yes. "My father would not want his name used to make your company look clean," she said. Richard folded his hands. "Then the fund will be legally independent, public reporting every year. outside oversight, no marketing campaign without board approval, no scholarship recipients used in advertisements. Denise glanced at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded slightly. Annie kept reading. And Victor? His suspension remains. The investigation will decide further action, but he will not return to authority over aircraft safety under me. That sounds like company language. It is, Richard admitted. The plain version is this. He will not be put back where his pride can endanger people. Annie looked up. Richard continued, and neither will I, if I refuse to change the kind of people I listen to. That mattered more than he probably knew. Denise placed both pages side by side. Annie, this is your decision. Not mine. Annie turned to her. You're my mother. I am. Which is why I am telling you not to shrink your answer to protect my pride. Annie's throat tightened. Denise's eyes softened. Your daddy left you that notebook because he wanted you to go farther than he was allowed to. Don't punish yourself because the door is being opened by somebody who should have opened it sooner. Eleanor leaned toward Annie. Accepting a key is not the same as forgiving the man who locked the door. Annie looked at Richard. I'll accept the scholarship. He started to speak. She raised her good hand slightly. But I choose the school. I choose whether I ever work for you. The fund uses my father's full name, Samuel D. Carter, and every student who gets that scholarship hears the real story, not a polished version. Richard nodded. Agreed. And one more thing. Yes? Annie rested her bandaged hand on the notebook. The first lesson in that program won't be about planes. What will it be? Listening. Richard looked at the notebook, then at her. Then that is where it starts. 1 year later, Annie Carter walked into her first aerospace systems lecture with a scar across her right palm and Samuel Carter's notebook in her bag. She had chosen Georgia Tech, close enough for Denise to drive over with food when she decided the dining hall had failed her child, far enough that Annie could begin her own life. The first weeks were hard in ways nobody applauded. Math did not care that she had saved a jet. Lab partners did not always know what to do with her story. Some professors treated her carefully, some skeptically, and one called her Miss Carter with such steady respect that she almost cried after class. On the first page of a new notebook, she wrote, Dad. They finally listened. Then she crossed out finally, stared at the line, and added beneath it, Now I have to make sure they keep listening. That fall, Whitmore Global opened the Samuel D. Carter Aviation Scholarship Fund in Atlanta. No red carpet, no orchestra. Denise had insisted on folding chairs, real food, and a program short enough that working families could get home before dark. The reception served fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, sweet tea, coffee, and peach cobbler from a bakery Samuel used to love. 12 students stood in the front row. Some wore suits borrowed from cousins, some wore dresses bought for church. One young woman kept smoothing her sleeves because she had never been inside a corporate building before. A young man from rural Alabama held his acceptance folder so tightly the edges bent. A girl from Savannah stared at the aircraft engine model on display as if it were calling her by name. Annie stood at the podium with her mother seated on one side and Eleanor on the other. Richard sat in the second row, not on stage. That had been Annie's request. He had accepted it without argument. Behind Annie, a bronze plaque had been mounted on the wall. The Samuel D. Carter Aviation Scholarship Fund. For those who hear what the world ignores. Annie looked at the 12 students. She saw nerves, hope, pride, fear. She recognized every bit of it. My father taught me that machines tell the truth in their own way, she said, but people have to be humble enough to hear it. The same is true with each other. Before you judge someone's place in a room, listen. Before you decide what a person can know, listen. Before fear makes you loud, listen. No one moved. She lifted her bandaged hand slightly, though by then it was only a scar. This mark came from a wire that kept sending a false signal. The system believed the lie until we cut it out. Some lies in this world work the same way. Lies about who belongs, who is smart, who should speak, who should sit down. This fund exists because my father refused to let those lies have the last word. In the front row, one student wiped her eyes. Annie closed the notebook. The first lesson is simple, she said. The machine doesn't care about your title. Truth doesn't care about your title either. So listen well. Work honestly. And when the room gets loud, don't forget the quiet thing telling you what's real. Afterward, Richard approached her near the engine model. He waited until Denise finished wrapping leftovers for 3 students she had decided were too thin. "Miss Carter," he said. Annie turned. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked at the plaque. "Your father's name looks right there." Annie followed his gaze. "Yes, it does. I still think about that flight every day." "So do I. I hope one day less of it is fear." Annie looked at her palm. "Some of it already is." Richard nodded. "And the rest?" She looked at the 12 students talking with Kyle near the engine model, at Eleanor correcting a reporter who nearly shortened Samuel's name, at Denise laughing with a mother who had driven 6 hours to be there. "The rest is work," Annie said. Richard accepted that. "Then we keep working." That evening, after the building emptied and the folding chairs were stacked, Annie stood alone before the plaque. She touched the raised letters of her father's name with her good hand. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "They're listening, Daddy." The building around her was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere down the hall, a student laughed. Someone rolled a cart across the floor. Outside, traffic moved through Atlanta, ordinary and alive. Annie picked up her bag, felt the weight of the old notebook inside, and walked toward the sound. The lesson of this story is that truth does not always come from the loudest voice, the highest title, or the most powerful person in the room. Sometimes it comes from the person everyone has been trained to overlook. Annie's courage reminds us that we should never judge someone's ability by their age, race, job title, or place in society. Real wisdom begins with listening, especially when fear, pride, and prejudice make the room too loud. The story also teaches that justice is not only about being recognized after doing something great. It is about opening doors so others will not have to fight so hard just to be heard. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.